2022, Dongshan City. A guy in a black t-shirt with black hair touches his face in surprise and says that this is not a dream. Sitting in his bed on the floor and looking at the purple rift in space right in front of him, he said that he woke up and the entrance to the dungeon was right at his house. In 2012, similar portals began to appear all over the world. After a series of riots caused by competition to explore these portals, the dungeon spiraled out of control. Soldiers armed with machine fight goblins running at them. The government has introduced 5 rules. 1. You can't get rid of the portal, but a raid can seal it. 2. If you fail to close it within the specified time limit, the defense will fall, and the dungeon monsters will flood into this world. 3. People who get lost in the dungeon and still survive are doomed to stay there, becoming adventurers. 3 men, a swordsman, an archer, and a mage stand in a battle stance in the forest, surrounded by wolf-mouthed monsters. 4. The higher the level of monsters in the dungeon, the greater the. 10 years later, because of the continuous appearance of new portals and their endless captures, the world has gradually come to terms with this. About dungeons and adventurers has gradually begun to leak out to the public. In addition, the Canadian edition of Adventurer Weekly published a research. The lack of jobs, the hungry rich, and the importance of social status, which is chased by everyone from bandits to officials, have contributed to the fact that the profession of an adventurer in the hearts of people has become a cherished dream. To the public, adventurers are the root of evil, an opportunity that can't be exploited, but it can't be eradicated either. The host of the evening show asks a man in a yellow suit with white hair that his profession has brought him more than $500 million in the last 3 years. The main character's name is Changhai, and he is one of the few people who knows this dirty little secret. Changhai scratches his head thoughtfully, wearing glasses, a black t-shirt, and yellow shorts. Looking at the entrance of the dungeon, he told him that he had caused him trouble. He thought about the fact that 5 years ago, the death rate when entering an entry-level dungeon was 50%, and half of the cases were fatal. Thinking about it with a tense face, he concluded that, as much as he needed the money, the risk was too great. Changhai is an expert on the secrets. He took out his phone and decided that it was better to give it to the government, or rather the Adventurers Guild. He recalled that when an ordinary citizen found the entrance to a dungeon and surrendered it, they were rewarded with rare treasures. An alert from a news channel appeared on the phone screen that an association employee in Shanghai was arrested by the police today. And according to reliable sources, this person is suspected of murder and reselling portal coordinates. Changhai stared intently at the phone screen and shook his head, saying that he wouldn't necessarily get someone who wanted to kill, thinking about whether these people would rent out the portal later. Then he thought that it would be impossible to sell the portal to some financial organization either, because they would have to use it at least 10 times in the beginning and in the future. In order to prevent him from selling the items that he would receive as a reward, they would follow him. And then he looked at the portal again and thought that he shouldn't just leave it like that either, because as soon as the time runs out, he will turn, the monsters will break out. And this will inevitably lead to victims and destruction of state facilities, and the main character can be soldered for 2. Changhai decided that the first step was to check the portal's level, and if his death rate was higher than normal, then he would just move to another city, and before leaving, call the police to deal with it themselves. He added that if the survival rate is normal, then he will try to cope with it. He opened the treasure hunter picture book on his phone on the dungeon portal level table. Next to the image of the purple portal, it says that this is a hunting entrance to the dungeon, which has a survival rate of 80%, and that the tasks in it are mainly related to hunting monsters in T. 2 days later, a yellow uniformed courier called at Changhai's door, announcing that he was a courier. Changhai opened the door a crack and told him to come in. The courier handed him a box with a receipt for receiving the parcel and asked him to sign. While Changhai was signing, the courier quietly asked him that he had discovered a new portal, explaining that otherwise he would not need to buy chain mail, which caused the main character to turn pale in surprise. Taking the bat in his hands, he waved it in the air and, laughing awkwardly, said that he was just playing war games, broke the previous one, so decided to buy a new one, and asked if there were any problems. Turning around, the courier adjusted his cap, smiled awkwardly, and said he was just asking. Changhai stared after him intently through the doorway and thought that even though he had long known how eager ordinary people were to become adventurers, talking about such things so bluntly scared him. He closed the door and turned abruptly to the box. After taking off his clothes, he changed into chainmail and iron armor, replacing his glasses with contact lenses, and armed himself with a fire axe that he bought at a nearby fire equipment store. The main character noticed that the armor is heavy and a little tight in the chest, and looking at himself, said that he is grateful that it does not restrict movement. He stared intently at the portal to the dungeon and stepped inside. After leaving the portal, the main character found himself in the forest and noticed that the first enemy would be werewolves. He was glad that he had bought the chainmail for a good reason, and noted while waving his finger in the air that according to official information, after a newbie entered the dungeon, the adventurer's panel and exit conditions would be activated. Status, inventory, achievements, and task buttons appeared in the air. He opened his status, where it says his name, race, first adventurer rating, that his profession and nickname are missing, and the main characteristics read Strength 9, Agility 9, Physique 10, Intelligence 16, Perception 10, Charisma 11. That the basic stats of ordinary people are about 10, the weaker ones have 8, and the outstanding ones have 14, and he didn't train, so he was counting on 9, not 16. He smiled smugly and said that charisma and intelligence might not be the most useful stats at an early stage, but 16 intelligence points are not so common. Then he added that strength, agility, and physique can be improved through training, but intelligence can't. He chuckled and told himself to calm down, then decided to read the terms and conditions and clicked on the tasks button. The blue dialog box said, Murloc Hunting Season, Challenge Level 2, Current Challenger 1 of 5. Exit conditions: kill any Murloc. Completion conditions: destroy the Murloc squad. There are 9 trials left in this dungeon. After passing the level, the tests will be cancelled. 28 days, 18 hours, and 42 minutes. Changhai opened his mouth in shock and shouted about how he was allergic to water reptiles, and whether it was impossible to kill him. A Murloc with huge eyes, fins, and gills walked through the forest, armed with a spear and made gurgling sounds. The main character's eyes appeared in the bushes, and he jumped out at the Murloc with a cry, swinging the axe. The Murloc saw this and jumped back, causing the blow to only graze his arm. The Murloc said in its own language that the captain was right, and adventurers do come into this forest. Evening came. The main character wipes sweat from his forehead, removing his helmet, and says that perhaps the difficulty of this dungeon was indicated incorrectly. Standing next to a dead Murloc lying on the ground, from which an axe protruded, Changhai noted that he had barely managed one, and thinking about what would happen if there were several of them, he wondered if he should go back right now. To the main character's surprise, a dialogue box appeared in front of him, saying that his level was increased. In the window with the status of the main character, the adventurer rating changed to the 2nd level and a nickname appeared, I'm with Murlocs 50 minutes 50. He got angry at the insult, picked up the Murloc spear, and decided that was enough for today, and that he would challenge this dungeon after hiring a personal fitness trainer and improving his core stats. As he went back to the portal, Chai Han walked out of the portal to his room and collapsed on the couch, moaning that he was tired a lot, adding that it was the first time he had gotten up from the couch in half a year. A dialogue box appeared in front of him, with the dungeon exit condition highlighted in green. The main character noted that the mission was completed, and that strange things happen after leaving the dungeon. The dialogue box says that the adventurer has been found to have left the dungeon, and that the settlement is starting soon. Changhai chuckled and said that he was asking for some, saying that he should be given a magic bottle so that he could improve all of his stats. The dialogue box announced that the calculation was completed. Ditrity rating comment. You can order more dishes, additional standard props, standard thermos flask. The main character raised his hands in rage and shouted about what other dishes, asking if he hadn't just leveled up. Deciding that something was better than nothing, he decided to see what this thermos can do. A thermos flask appeared in the protagonist's hand. The dialogue box reported that this item is able to condense 500 milliliters of pure water daily, and that an improvement is available. In a rage, he shouted about who got the trash and threw the thermos bottle on the floor. Second day, gym building. Changhai said hello and said that he had an appointment with Coach In. A short-haired, red-haired girl wearing a blue top with black straps said that he must be Changhai and told him that the coach was waiting for him in the VIP lounge. She showed him the way, and he followed her. Changhai thought about how he didn't think that a small town like Dongshin, would have a trainer who specialized in providing body shaping services for new adventurers. Such important indicators for adventurers as strength, dexterity, and endurance can be improved with the help of exercises. Changhai thought hard that his book fee was barely enough to cover his expenses, but since this training would help him improve his stats, it would be worth it. The girl asked him with a smile if he was already doing fitness, and Changhai said no. She asked why such expenses would be necessary, adding that a regular coach would be enough for beginners. She then looked at him with her eyes and said, eyes slightly closed, and asked if he had become an adventurer. Changhai remarked that she was quite straightforward and told her that if a person had a goal, they should hire a better coach, and added that he thought that for adventurers, a regular coach wasn't the most suitable option, flexing his hand into a fist and smiling. She replied that he should be able to then, and pulled on the door handle. The protagonist thought hard about wondering what the best coach in Dongshin looked like. The girl announced to coach and that they had come to see him. Changhai saw a man with long blonde hair wearing a pink tank top wiping sweat from his face. The main character thought that this wasn't exactly what he expected, that he thought it would be a huge beefy man, and in front of him just a guy with a pretty face. A huge man twice the size of the main character, standing to the left of him and looking down from above, said that his course costs a lot of money and not everyone can afford it. The main character turned around in surprise and looked at him. Coach and rank AAA, asked him about his desire to become an adventurer. The main character does a bench press while coach and counts. Changhai's hands are shaking and he tells him that he can't do it, but he can't do it anymore after 5 times. The coach took the barbell out of his hands and said that's all for today. Changhai sits down and tries to catch his breath. The coach notes that it was 5 times 30 kilograms and you need to increase to 35 kilograms. He added that even with the discount that he is a beginner. Given his weight, the result is very weak. Changhai grits his teeth and thinks that he knows that his physical capabilities are below average and that this is not enough, noting that the average figure is 50 kilograms. The man in the pink t-shirt says that the main character's foundation is weak and notes that the limit value of 35 kilograms when converted to the adventurer's indicator should be 9. Kochin says that the values of strength, endurance, and agility of ordinary people are relatively balanced. Still breathing heavily, Changhai turns to them and asks how long it will take him. The coach replies that everything depends on him, and if he practices every day, then in a month and a half you can reach the value of 11, and after the transformation, he will become an adventurer of B rank and will feel much stronger. The main character replied that he understood and said that he would train according to this plan. He asked how to pay for it, and the coach told him to drop it on WeChat. The man in the pink tank top was glad that he wasn't going to be studying alone anymore and introduced himself as Zumao. Changhai introduced himself in response, saying that he was a writer. Changhai and Zumao are sitting at the bar in a burger joint. Zumao asks why he signed up to coach and, adding that although he is a professional, it is not cheap. He asked why there was a rush, saying that classes at home or a simpler coach could also improve physical abilities. Then he said that usually only adventurers with experience or who have signed a long-term contract with the association use the services of such a coach, adding that if he was not an adventurer in Wales, he would not be able to afford the services of Anne's coach while holding a bitten burger in his. Holding a ketchup fries in his hand, Changhai replied with a smile that he was not short of money, so he was spending his fees, explaining that since he had a clear goal, he decided to find the best coach to lay a solid foundation. Zumao propped his head on his back and said that he thought he had discovered the entrance to the dungeon and was forced to become an adventurer. He gave the main character a cold look and said that since he was just planning on becoming one, he should teach him something so that they wouldn't try to trick him later. Zumao turned to the main character with a smile, and there was a sign above his head. Leave him to die. He said that the first time you enter a dungeon, each adventurer gets a corresponding title based on their stats, and they can choose whether to wear it or not. He explained that attributes and stuff. He said that the hunter in turn would always know who became an adventurer and would follow that person to find the entrance to the dungeon. Zumao noticed that Changhai didn't react and concluded that Changhai wasn't really an adventurer, but just a writer with money who intended to become an adventurer, as if there was nothing wrong with that. Adjusting his glasses, Changhai said with interest on his face that he would remember. Despite the stony expression on his face, Changhai thought that it was a good thing that he had become an adventurer and that he would be able to get into the dungeon if he didn't use his title, otherwise he would have been exposed today. Hu Mao said that Kochun must have already finished with the contract and called for the protagonist to go. Kochun is sitting at a table with a laptop, surrounded by awards and cups, in front of a girl with red hair. He says that Changhai is a fairly well-known writer specializing in adventure novels, and that it's not surprising that he has the financial resources and motivation to attend his classes. The girl said that he also doesn't have any special deadline requirements, so it doesn't look like he found the entrance to the dungeon, and he has a month left to complete the task. Kochun said with a grim face that the probability that Changhai was an adventurer, or that he had found the entrance to the dungeon, was extremely low, and said that if Zhu Mao didn't say anything when they returned, proceed as usual. Kochun stands up from his seat with a grim face. The title, Rookie Killer, is visible above his head. He said that as long as the Dongshin Elite Dungeon trial didn't disappear, he definitely wouldn't miss out on the opportunity to earn some money. Zhu Mao and Changhai enter the room, where Kochan and his assistant are waiting for them. He notices the title above Kochan's head, but doesn't show it. Kochan tells him that the contract has been drawn up, and if there are no problems after reading it, he can sign it. The main character agreed with a smile, nervous in his head about how even the coach is an adventurer. The girl showed him where to go. Scratching his neck, Zhu Mao replied that he couldn't because they had a contract. Zhu Mao is a level 6 contract adventurer. When Kochan left, he said that there was no need to constantly monitor the main character. Changhai put the papers on the table and said that everything was ready. The girl gave him a copy of it and asked him to wait a bit, saying that Kochan would test it. The main character is trying to catch his breath while sitting on a treadmill. The coach says that this is enough, writing something down on paper, and concludes that the assessment of his physical form is extremely disappointing. He said that they would not do an agility test, and next week they would focus on strength exercises and fitness, asking at what time it was convenient for him. Wiping his face, the main character replied that he was always comfortable. Before leaving, Kochan told him to come back tomorrow at 10 in the morning and not eat anything greasy for breakfast. Lying face down on the bed, Changhai says that he didn't think the largest chain of fitness centers in China would do such a thing, and that they just used the name of the main character as bait. He added that if he made any mistakes, they would immediately understand that he was hiding something up. Then it dawned on him, and he sat up excitedly. He realized that all services related to adventurers were similar to this one, including the chainmail he bought. Looking at his phone, the protagonist thought that he was lucky that he realized in time that it was unwise to buy chainmail and weapons in the same store. Otherwise, it would definitely arouse suspicion, and that he underestimated the risks of being an adventurer. Looking at the portal, he thought that he needed to adjust his plans. Changhai walked out of the portal in the forest, clad in armor, and said that he originally thought to return here after he finished training, but he didn't expect that the real world would be so violent that low-level adventurers were waiting at every turn. Looking at the interface buttons, he tiredly said that even though he was lucky to avoid trouble today, he wouldn't always be lucky, and that the only way to level up was to take the risk. The exit conditions on the dialogue box changed to a pair of murloc eyeballs. Noticing this, the protagonist remembered the murloc he killed yesterday, and went to where his corpse was, saying that he didn't know if yesterday's eyeball would come off. On the ground lies a gnawed murloc with its body cut open. While holding his nose, Changhai noticed that the internal organs had been eaten and asked who had done it. He noticed that the eyes weren't eaten and was glad that he didn't have to fight, so he sat down on the ground next to the dead murloc and said that he would just walk around and make a few notes about the place. A murloc appeared and shouted at him in its own language, asking if he was the killer. The main character exhaled when he realized they were murlocs, and shouted at him that he could make him one when the second one appeared. Changhai started running away with all his might, shouting that he couldn't beat to people and needed to run. Evening came. The main character and the murloc stand side by side, trying to catch their breath. The murloc fiercely pointed its spear at Changhai and shouted in its own language. The latter, grinning, wiped his face and told him that he was going to die any minute. But everything was bragging, asked him if he understood. He pointed gloatingly next to the murloc and shouted that it and its companion had split up, which surprised the murloc. Changhai smiled maliciously with the axe in his hands, looking down at the murloc. With a blow of his axe, he sliced it in half. The second Murloc jumped out of the bushes and charged at the main character, shouting. He turned and smiled ominously. The Murloc was startled. Swinging the axe, he shouted at him to run, running after him. The dialogue box says that an adventurer has been found to have left the dungeon and announces the beginning of the settlement. The following dialogue box says that his performance as an adventurer is low and there is no reward. Changhai gritted his teeth in surprise, thinking that he was clearly better this time and asking why there was no reward. Leaning back on the sofa, he asked if the drop rate in dungeons of this level was really that low. Stretching his hand up in front of him, he thought about how if that was the case, adventurers wouldn't be able to earn money and assumed that there was something that everyone knew except for him. Looking at his phone, he considered asking Ju Mao and the coach tomorrow, but decided to make sure that they'd be able to earn money. They definitely didn't think he was a dungeon owner and a novice adventurer. Day 2. Ju Mao asked again about how Ju Mao and coach and didn't show up, and the girl replied that Ju Mao had gone to another city and would be back in a couple of days, and coach and was busy today and wouldn't be back until noon. He replied that he would go to the VIP lounge. Changhai runs on a treadmill with a mask on his face. Ju Mao asks coach and about the fact that the main character has been training so much for the past few days that he wasn't there, to which the coach replies in the affirmative. He notes that he is quite persistent and that he's not going to be far off when he will raise his strength and agility to 11. He explained that if he continues like this and is not slowed down by injuries, then his strength, agility, and overall body condition can rise to 12 pretty quickly. Ju Mao turned to the coach with a smile and asked if he was considering recruiting him, explaining that he was a rich and persistent candidate and would definitely become a successful adventurer in the future. The coach replied that he had asked him while Ju Mao was away, but he refused and said that he wanted to become a black adventurer. That is, not affiliated with associations and companies, not subject to supervision and restrictions, and having more freedom, and then work solo. In response, Ju Mao. Changhai is lying on the treadmill, trying to catch his breath. Ju Mao walked up to him and said with a smile that he was working too hard and would get hurt if he trained so hard, adding that he had a whole year ahead of him. He sat up and replied that he wanted to become an adventurer as soon as possible and that he was afraid that, if it took too long, his finances would simply run out. Ju Mao thought about the price of an adventure and said that he would be able to make an adventurer's quota on the black market, which only increases over time, and agreed. Changhai sits at a table in a burger joint and stares intently at his burger, thinking that given the fact that the coach tried to recruit him, he can be sure that they've ruled out the possibility that he's an adventurer, even if he's an entry-level one, and now it's just a matter of finding the right time. Ju Mao walked over to the table with a tray of food in his hands and asked him why he was frozen and what he was thinking. He replied with a smile that he was just tired and a little distracted. Ju Mao replied with a serious face, holding a French fry with ketchup in his hand, that it wouldn't work that way, and the constant exertion of overwork only increases the risk of injury, and injury will slow him down. Changhai replied that he had already realized that the amount of training needed to be reduced and, pretending to remember casually, asked when he had managed to recoup the initial investment in the adventurer profession. Ju Mao shook his head and said that he hadn't succeeded yet, and he needed to wait until his level reached at least 11 before he could think about making something pay off. The main character asked in surprise why after level 11. Ju Mao explained that this is because low-level adventurers, especially those from 1 to 5, are useless to mess with, and the survival rate is lower than average only in campaigns led by veterans. He said that adventurers without ambition usually choose mixed levels, and at 6 minutes 10 levels, the diff. He added that the survival rate is not as high as in the previous stage, and said that only at level 11. When the difficulty level does not allow mixing, do adventurers start to make a profit, and adventurers at this level already have sufficient strength and agility. He explained that equipment, items, and skill books, everything that helps you level up, are sold at a very high price. Changhai said that he didn't understand why level 6 minutes 10 adventurers didn't actively prepare if a level 11 dungeon was so dangerous. Ju Mao replied that for many reasons. He started to explain that first of all, the Adventurers Association doesn't officially force adventurers to attack dungeons, so most of them prefer to retire in order to return to normal life when they reach level 11. He added that few adventurers make it to elite dungeons, and that compared to levels 11 minutes 15, which have great advantages in addition to risks, at level 6 minutes 10. Relying on information gathering and logistics can recoup the initial investment and even get a little bit on top, and that suck. Changhai realized that this was why Zhu Mao decided to stay at the 6th level for a longer time. Looking at his phone while sitting on the couch at home, Changhai says that he really learned a lot and that it's not surprising that he can't find any useful information. Because most of the community does this just to make money, he said that they only provide information to others, and in the future, all owners of low-level dungeons will be eliminated. Recalling Zhu Mao's words, he thought that what surprised him the most was that in the dungeon, the reward can only be obtained once, even if the mission is completed several times. He looked at the portal and found that the dungeon was not only a place to live, and thought that looking at it from this point of view, the only value that could be taken out was the quota for automatically turning all those lost in it into adventurers. The main character changed into his armor, and thought that given the risks associated with selling adventurous places, and the fact that he is not short of money, he will try to clear this dungeon as much as possible, and then consider whether to continue his career as an adventurer. He decided to try the method that Zhu Mao had taught him and focus on gathering information early on, before thinking about the rest. The dialogue box says, Working Season for Murlocs, Challenge Level 2. Exit conditions: find a lake. Completion conditions: destroy the Murloc squad. There are 7 tests left in this dungeon. After completing a level, the tests will be cancelled. There are 19 days, 18 hours, and 43 minutes left until the main character was surprised that this mission also did not require combat, and was glad that he took advantage of Zhu Mao's experience and bought a drone, because finding the lake without it would not be the easiest task. Murlocs run through the forest after a creature with a large red tail. One of the Murlocs spots the drone and shouts something in their own language. Changhai looks in surprise at the screen on the drone's remote control and sees from Murlocs and one large orange Murloc with large pointed swimming trunks looking at the drone. The big orange Murloc let out a loud growl, baring its huge teeth in its mouth. The Murlocs scattered in different directions, disappearing into the forest vegetation. Changhai, looking intently at the screen, wondered if it was a Murloc and concluded that, although its appearance and aura were different from those Murlocs he had fought before, he was sure that it was also a Murloc, but of a higher level and with more advanced abilities. He decided to complete his mission first, and then return to the search for the orange Murloc. Looking around, the Murlocs emerged from the bushes. Simple Murlocs looked at the drone and pointed at it, while orange Murlocs looked in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, Changhai announced that he had found the lake. The drone flies over a lake located among the trees. Sitting on the ground near a tree, the main character, smiling, says that it is not surprising that there are so many Murlocs in this forest. He then looks around and sees since there has been such a large lake all this time, he said that the exit conditions must be met. The task dialog box turned red and the exit condition changed to a fake lake. A black dialog box with red text announced that the map was being changed and the dungeon's rating had been increased. The main character looked questioningly in the direction from which the sound came, and found a large orange Murloc looking at him. Sputtering and making a loud noise, the Murloc lunged towards the main character and smashed the drone's remote control with a blow of its clawed hand. Changhai jumped back and took out a knife. He noted that he was glad that he managed to react to the Murloc's attack, otherwise it would have caused him a serious injury. He glanced with annoyance at the drone's control panel lying on the ground, broken into pieces. Then, he checked himself, decided that this wasn't the time to think about it, and this Murloc was too fast and he would have to be careful. 4 simple green Murlocs emerged from the forest behind the orange Murloc, and the protagonist counted them, noting that they were all around him. The orange Murloc lunged at Changhai and struck him in the shoulder with its claws, shattering his male shoulder and leaving him with a wound. He noted the Murloc's speed by looking at the blood spurting from the wound on his shoulder. The Murloc looked back at the main character and asked in its own language what was going on. Changhai thought that, if it wasn't for the chainmail, he would probably have lost an arm by now, and wondered if it was true that novice adventurers had to deal with such creatures. Standing in a threatening pose, the orange Murloc asked in its own language why this person was so difficult to kill. Gritting his teeth, he glanced at the orange Murloc and thought that it would be fine if he only had to fight it, but he would also have to spend energy on ordinary Murlocs, and noticed that the difficulty of this dungeon was much higher than the stated one. Looking back at the portal behind the trees, he decided to run, and a red system warning caught his attention. The dialogue box highlighted the text in red and warned that all achievements will be cancelled when you exit the dungeon. In front of the cave entrance, there are goblin corpses and small lights. A punch smashes the stone wall of the cave, and the murlocs are able to escape. A bespectacled man with a book in his hand tells the man with red hair, calling him Quan-kun, that he is just taking out his anger on the dead man and slams his book shut. The guy with glasses is called Bujaming, and he's a level 5 contract adventurer ranked in the top best companies for adventurers, and his title is 5 fireballs that destroy everything in their path. Quan Chong turned around and asked, "So what?" He is a level 5 contract adventurer, also ranked in the top best companies for adventurers, and his nickname is the Overbearing Fist of Rage. In front of him is a huge goblin body, slammed into the cave wall and covered with a dent from punching. Quan Chong says it's because he's too weak to resist. Bujaming replied that it would be strange if he could, even considering that his stated 5th level is quite equal to the 9th, saying that only Quan Chong would be lucky enough to encounter such a monster in an entry-level dungeon. Quan Chong said that he wanted to face the legendary bug monster that can only be encountered in the next stage of the dungeon, and that it doesn't scare him because he can always get a coupon to upgrade a miraculous item as compensation, and that he is convinced that he is destined to become a legendary adventurer. Quan Chong smiled confidently as he left. Bujaming thought about how they were only at the 5th level, and noted that the monster he was targeting was truly legendary. He wondered how Quan Chong planned to get such a rare coupon, and assumed that Quan Chong had just blurted it out without thinking. The dialogue box says, "Challenge level is unknown. Exit conditions, last 3 minutes with an abnormal murloc with high combat power. After completing the task, you will receive an additional compensation, a coupon for improving a wonderful item." Changhai angrily shouted at the window that he want a. The orange murloc leapt at the prodigal, raising its paw to strike, and shouted in its own language that it was finished. Changhai stares intently at the murloc's paw approaching him. Blood spurts out, and his helmet flies off his head. Changhai fell to the ground on his knees, and blood is coming out of his head, which is raised up, and he thinks that this is the end. The orange murloc speaks in its own language about being disappointed and being bored, and that leaves it to other murlocs. The main character stares blankly at the ground, the murloc spear in front of his face, and he thinks that if he could see the future, he would never have entered this dungeon and become adventurous. He thinks of the best-selling bookstore window. He thought that he knew what he had signed up for, and that he had often dreamed of getting into the dungeon over the past couple of years. He remembers his joy at first defeating the murloc and the hard training. Then he thinks about how he was wondering if he would become like the characters in his novels, who had to go through many dangerous situations and experience all the joys and tribulations of an adventurer's career firsthand. He remembers talking to Jumao. Changhai is kneeling on the ground, blood dripping from his head to the ground. He thinks that he is afraid of death, and that he is a coward who doesn't really know how to fight. He snatches up his axe and cuts one of the murlocs in half, shouting that he is also an adventurer and can't die here. The orange murloc turns around in disbelief and looks at what is happening. Swinging his axe, surrounded by murlocs, he tells himself to think about what trump card he has and what he can use. He remembers his title Murloc Fighter 1v1 and shouts that he wants to use it. A blue dialogue box appears above his head, stating that the Murloc Fighter 1v1 title has been used. It says, "Title effect automatically finds the nearest strongest murloc. The user who uses this title gains the target's strength, agility, and perception." The following dialogue box announces that the title has increased his stats: strength +1, agility +8, perception +6. Changhai swings the axe at the murloc, attacking him with a quick movement. His blue title is visible above his head, and he cuts the murloc in half. He notes that his body has become lighter and stronger, and he feels that all the murloc's movements have slowed down, suggesting that his vision has also improved. Glancing threateningly at the remaining two simple murlocs, who were visibly nervous, the protagonist thought that in this state, he could deal with them. After a moment of silence, the orange murloc said in its own language that it was strange, and asked why the man had suddenly become so strong, and what he had done. There are 4 murloc corpses lying behind the main character, and he heads towards the orange murloc, holding an axe in one hand and a murloc spear in the other. With a sinister smile, he told him that they were now alone. The orange murloc shouted at him in its own voice, and he said, not to get cocky just because it managed to get a couple of its low-level bipods. Changhai thought that he didn't know why, but this murloc's strength was incredible, and that even in this chainmail, he couldn't match its strength and speed. He threw the axe to the ground, grabbing the spear in both hands, and thought about how he only had one chance. And he only had to leave his defenses in one place, and the helmet would have to be removed, because this murloc would use a direct attack method to reach the speed limit. The main character reflected that he had determined the murloc's attack style and route, and he needed to give up the headguard to use it as bait, thereby winning the chance to exchange injuries and severely injure the opponent, and if he did not take this opportunity, then he would not have another chance to do something like this. He sighed and thought that he wasn't sure he'd survive this. And it was really terrible. Finding the moment to attack and swinging his spear, he decided that he had to try and get out of it. The main character and the orange murloc were behind each other, exchanging blows. The spear pierced through the murloc's mouth and throat, remaining in its body. Changhai chuckled with a blank stare. Blood gushed out from his neck, and he fell to the ground, asking about how he was good for nothing. The orange murloc, trembling, clutched at the spear stuck in its body, trying unsuccessfully to pull it out, and shouted in its own language that the fact that this weak little human managed to injure it was ridiculous, closing his eyes. The thought that this was a nightmare, and fell to the ground. A blue dialogue box appeared in front of the fainting Changhai, announcing that the death of an abnormal murloc with high combat power had been recorded and the mission completed, and announcing that the settlement was underway. The following message appeared on the dialogue box: calculation completed. For a novice adventurer, you have proven yourself to be incredible without fear of death. Received a new title, Escape Death, Hidden Bonus, Death Escapee Certificate, One-Time Item Received, Magic Item Upgrade Coupon. Friendly reminder: using this coupon on the thermos bottle that you received earlier will help you solve your problem. Lying in a pool of his own blood, Changhai tapped the button for a regular thermos flask, and it appeared in his hand. He said to apply the coupon to a regular thermos bottle, and the thermos flask glowed and turned into a glass jar with a red potion inside. A dialogue box labeled as Miracle Item Delivery announced that it was a magic blood restoration potion, and described its effect: daily produces a potion with a random flavor that can be used to heal injuries and restore physical strength. Changhai drank the red potion, and the wounds on his body healed. Exhaling heavily, he collapsed to the ground and noted how much it refreshed him. After a few minutes, he sat up and sighed, noticing that the wounds on his neck had already healed. The main character opened the status window and noticed that his perception increased slightly and was equal to 11. He asked what the exit conditions were now, and when he opened the task window, he drew attention to the conditions for completing them, which said to destroy the pond with the brood of murlocs, getting up from the ground and gathering up the spears of the defeated murlocs. He decided that he definitely couldn't do it right now and entered the portal. When he came out on the other side of the portal in his house, he noticed that the entrance to the dungeon had increased. He touched the portal with his hand, and the electric shock pushed his hand away. The blue dialogue box said, "Insufficient level. The entrance to the dungeon is closed. The number of trials in the dungeon is 10. After clearing the dungeon, the number of trials will be 0. Before the dungeon expansion, 89 days, 23 hours, 42 minutes. Changhai was surprised to see that his level was insufficient, and the level of the dungeon had increased. He said that the conditions he met to exit the dungeon had to belong to a higher level dungeon, and it was no wonder that the difficulty of the mission increased so much, and that he received an improved reward. A blue dialogue box reported that adventurers were found to have no job, and suggested applying for a transfer certificate to the hidden profession of Deathwalker. The main character remembered that there was someone on the forum who emphasized the importance of the profession. In the forum post, it is written that the 4 elements of an adventurer's power are the main characteristics, title, inventory, and profession, and the most important among these 4 Changhai clicked on the confirm button, and the dialogue box announced the change of profession, showing the download slider. A dark purple energy enveloped him, which surprised the protagonist. In the status window, the profession Deathwalker appeared. The dialogue box announced the effect of following death: 1 perception plus 5 2. The closer the adventurer is to death, the greater the strength and agility, Stat points increased from up to for 3 unlock rewards. Changhai was surprised to see that his perception was now 16. IND found that, even with his eyes closed, his brain could accurately imagine and perceive every corner of his life. He thought hard that he was afraid to imagine how people with a perception score of 20 would see the world. He remembered that his first title had synchronized his basic stats, strength, speed, and perception with the murlocs and wondered what the effect of his new title was. He dialog box reported that the effect is triggered when the wearer is seriously injured or dies, or encounters an enemy whose street. He reasoned that this bonus adds for points to strength, agility, and perception, and its effect is similar to his new profession. Then, he noticed that he would be able to gain +8 strength, agility, and perception in the new status under extreme conditions. He grinned nervously and said that if he was brave enough, he would be able to activate the self-harm effect on his own during the encounter with the enemy. Kill the enemy, and then use a recovery potion. He was glad that thanks to the potion, his options were limitless, and he no longer had to worry. A month later, his breathing high holds a barbell in the gym. His muscles noticeably increased. And, exhaling, he lifted the barbell with large weights above his head. Zhu Mao, who was standing next to him and wiping his face with a towel, looked at him in surprise and thought to himself, who would have thought that a rookie would be able to achieve such a result in less than 2 months, and it usually takes a whole year to do such a thing. He thought that if it had been anyone else, he would have been taken to the intensive care unit long ago, which means that he has an amazing physique and suggested that it might be 17 minutes 18. Thinking that Kokken had made a big mistake, he walked up to Changhai and threw him a bottle, congratulating him on how confident he was that his strength and agility had already reached level 12, and with his current level, he would definitely be able to meet the conditions to exit the dungeon. The main character caught the bottle and began to drink from it in large sips. Zhu Mao asked him if he would like to join Wales, and he replied with a smile that he didn't want to be held back by any contractual obligations. Zhu Mao spread his hands and shook his head, saying that he thought they could go on raids together as colleagues. Changhai smilingly told him that even if they weren't colleagues, they could still go on raids together, and told him that he was going to purchase a couple of dungeon spots after asking him for advice. He thought about it. Changhai asked in surprise, a non-specialized alliance. Then, he asked if he understood correctly that they were the largest non-specialized group. Raising his palm up, Zhu Mao replied that if he was going to buy a place in a dungeon on the black market, he would advise him to choose a place in a low-level dungeon that was covered by the guarantee of a non-specialized alliance. The main character asked why. He explained to him that usually deals involving the sale of adventurer seats are accompanied by quite large risks for both the seller and the beer. And usually sellers are afraid that some veteran will pretend to be a novice, and buyers that after receiving the money, the seller will simply disip. He added that this does not apply to those transactions that accompany a non-specialized alliance, although they do have quite a large commission. And in transactions that relate to the purchase of an adventurer's seat and other things related to dungeons, they ensure that the seller is in control. Sitting on the bed in his room, Changhai looks at his phone and says that he has checked all the available ads, and out of all of them, only the seller from Yanzhou City seems to be more or less reliable, and he has the guarantee of a non-specialized alliance. On the phone screen, a chat is opened with the seller, where Changhai is signed as a Dongshan citizen who likes to write, and the seller is an old driver from Yanzhou. Changhai asked if there were any more seats, to which the vendor replied that they had recruited 6 people and were waiting for tea. 2 days later, Changhai is standing in a night park in Yanzhou City, looking at his phone. He texted the salesman that he was there, and the salesman replied that he could see him. A man with a beefy body, a beard, a white t-shirt on his hairy chest, orange pants, and a jacket tied around his waist ran up to him. He announced his presence loudly, and Changhai turned around. He asked him again if he was really an old driver from Yanzhou, and the latter replied in the affirmative. The seller then turned around and ran, hurrying the main character, announcing that they would now sign a contract and go to the dungeon. The contractor of a non-specialized alliance in a purple suit and pointy-eared glasses signed the paper with a pentagram with a smile and announced to the audience that this contract consists of 3 points. The first is that the final payment of the beer will be in a special account that they will provide, and that the seller will help them in performing the above-mentioned services, and they will transfer the money to the beer. The transfer of the final payment to the merchant's account will only be He continued by explaining that after entering a dungeon, the seller is prohibited from doing things that might violate the security agreement, ignore dangerous situations, or take force against buyers. And the beer is prohibited from divulging the location of the entrance to a given dungeon. He asked if anyone else had any questions about the contract. A man in a yellow sleeveless jacket with the nickname Leader and a man with long white hair with the nickname Liang answered that there were no questions. Changhai and an elderly man with white hair with a confused expression with the nickname Hateful Hatred answered that there were no questions. The contractor smiled with his sharp teeth and said that in this case the contract would take effect, and the pentagram on paper turned yellow. Yellow pentagrams lit up on the adventurer's hands. The fat guy with the nickname You Don't Mind Me Making Fun of You and the thin guy in a white shirt with the nickname Security Squad Leader were surprised to find glowing pentagrams on their hands. Putting the pen back in the breast pocket of his jacket, the contractor announced that this would be the end of his work, and as he left, he waved to them and said that he hoped they would do more work in the future. The salesman dusted off his hands and smilingly told everyone not to disperse, and he would lead them to the dungeon entrance. At an abandoned construction site, a salesman points out the blue entrance to the dungeon to adventurers. A man in a business suit and glasses with the nickname Dungeon Finance Specialist admired that the entrance was indeed well hidden, and it was no wonder that neither the authorities nor the townspeople had been able to find it for so long. The Leader and Liang exchanged glances, and the Leader smiled. With a smile, pointing at the portal with his hand, the seller invited them to enter the portal in turn. They came out in a level for Dungeon Forest, the Witch Forest. A thin man in a jacket asked who was waiting for them in the dungeon, turned to the salesman and asked if they were newbies. The fat guy jumps up and down in glee, shouting confirmation that he's an adventurer. The seller grinned and answered in the affirmative and said that they even seemed to be traveling. Changhai noticed the conversation between the shop assistant and the man in the jacket and noticed that there were originally two of them. The salesman clapped his hands and asked for a moment of attention. He told them to repeat loudly after him. Status window. The adventurers did as he said, and interface buttons appeared in front of them. The salesperson explained to the adventurers that this window will show them their characteristics as an adventurer, and that by scrolling down below, they can check the details of the current mission, and that the content of the status window is only visible to them, so they don't have to worry. The man in the jacket announced that they could now tell them their exit conditions, so they could sort them out. The fat guy, looking at his status window, clutched his head and shouted that he had very low stats. Changhai looked back at him and looked at his tasks. He dialog box read, exit conditions, hear the banshee voice, clearing conditions, kill the banshee. The main character noted in horror that there was no banshee among the list of newbie dungeons. Changhai was afraid that this dungeon had the same bug as the dungeon in his apartment, and he thought that based on the survivor's mistake, if the monster from the beginner's dungeon wasn't included in the beginner's guide, there were two options: either it was an extremely rare case, or all the adventurers who had disappeared to encounter it, they died. The pentagram on the bespectacled man's arm screamed that the man had violated the security agreement and given a false condition for exiting the dungeon. Changhai noticed this. The leader of the security team, smiling slyly and keeping his hands in his pants pockets, asked about the fact that they hadn't even started yet and someone had already managed to break the security agreement by looking at the man with glasses. The leader looked at him in silence, and the man with glasses, smiling nervously, shouted that this was some kind of bug, and his condition for leaving was to collect valuable herbs. The man in the jacket looked at the man threateningly and said that the contractor's contract wasn't always able to give out 100% correct information. But with such a newcomer, he definitely couldn't have such problems, and concluded that his condition for going out was definitely not to collect VA. The man fell to the ground in fear, trying to find words, when the leader came up to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and told the man in the jacket that he had only recently become an adventurer and didn't know all the rules yet, so it was normal for him to make mistakes and ask for another chance. The leader lightly nudged the man with his hand. He clasped his hands in supplication and asked him to forgive him and give him another chance. After a short pause, the man in the jacket agreed. The seller asked everyone to announce their conditions for exiting the dungeon and clarified that they should not be mistaken. The man said that his mission was to find the lake banshee. The fat guy said that his mission was to hear the banshee's voice. Changhai said that his mission was to look up. Liang, who was standing next to the worried hateful man, asked if these missions were dangerous. The man replied that it all depends on the situation and told them not to be afraid because they will not have any problems with them. Hateful Hate put his hand on his chest, trying to calm down, and said that it wasn't so bad yet. The salesman turned to them and told them that he would take them to the witch lakes in the forest, and told them to keep up. They came to the edge of a forest lake. The man in blazers called up the adventurers panel and took out a harmonica. The leader of the security team asked the salesman what he was doing, and the salesman replied with a smile that he was summoning a lake banshee. A man in a jacket plays the harmonica. He asks the seller how he found out the method of calling her, to which he replied that this is a secret of the company. A girl with light blue hair and pointed ears poked her head out of the water. It flew up into the air, and the fat guy pointed at it and shouted that he had found it. The leader and the man with glasses said that they completed their mission by looking at the dialogue boxes. Changhai looks intently at the banshee and counts to 10, then calls up the status window that says that the exit condition has been met. The salesman told them to use earplugs because the banshees would sing their song. The fat guy asked, putting earplugs in his ears, what would happen if they were not inserted. Picking his ear, the salesman replied that witch chanting would destroy his brain, adding that a first-level beginner who had just become an adventurer would surely die immediately. The fat guy covered his ears and said, "Well, Hateful Hate," and the bespectacled man screamed in fear. The man in the jacket continues to play the harmonica, and the banshee begins to sing back, raising his hand in the air. The nose of the bespectacled man and the fat guy started to bleed, and their faces turned red. Changhai noticed that his nose was bleeding, even though he only heard the beginning of her song. He was glad that he was wearing earplugs, otherwise he would have been dead by now. He thought that this was to be expected of a creature from a dungeon that wasn't listed in the beginner's guide. The man in blazers stopped playing the harmonica, moving it away from his lips. The banshee noticed this and dived back into the water. The man waved to the adventurers, explaining that everyone had been able to complete their mission, and added that they could return the same way they came. The leader of the guard squad, wiping the blood from his nose, retorted that he had done a little research before coming here and found out that the plants and minerals from the dungeons were of great value. He said that he was sure they were in a hurry to send them off just to collect everything all. The man in the jacket stared at him in silence with a dark look. Smiling smugly, the leader of the guard squad said that they had paid for everything and asked why they couldn't collect valuable herbs and minerals in the dungeon to restore the blood loss. The salesman shouted at him that it wasn't in the contract. He replied that there were no rules against it either, and the salesman gritted his teeth. Changhai asked Wu Liang about the fact that adventurers can collect herbs and minerals. He replied that in fact, most adventurers can't pass through customs, and their main method of making a profit is collecting resources and information about monsters. Turning to the leader of the security team, the man in the jacket said that he had not been able to collect anything. The man in the jacket clarified that he believed that once the task was completed, they could not take measures against them within the framework of the contract, so that they would. He smiled wickedly and asked the man in the jacket if that was the case. Smiling maliciously back, the man told him that there was one thing he hadn't considered. Liang stiffened. The man in the jacket said that he didn't sign the contract with them and took out an oblong object from the inventory. Leader Yu Liang blocked his path by crossing his hands, and he asked what they were doing. Liang pounded his fist. The title of the combat expert was displayed above his head, and he said that he wouldn't work without it. The leader said with a grin that he thought his argument made sense because it was just herbs and minerals, and they weren't worth making such a fuss about. The vendor shouted that according to the contract, if he didn't exit the dungeon, they wouldn't receive the final payment, and if he died due to collecting resources, they would all suffer losses. The leader, to the seller's surprise, told him that he could protect them in exchange for resources on their part. The salesman smiled and held up the palm of his hand, apologizing and saying that they were not going to do anything. They weren't willing to take that risk. The leader clarified with a smile that it was out of fear of taking risks and suggested that there were other secrets in this dungeon, and they were afraid that they would discover them during the resource gathering, and the vendor gritted his teeth nervously. He told the leader that he was far from a novice and had come here for a mission. The veins on the salesman's face bulged. He called out to the man in the jacket, calling him Liao Liao, who was standing in front of Liang with gritted teeth, asking what he was doing. Liang told Liao Liao that he should see for himself which of the two was strong. Liao Liao stared at him in silence, gritting his teeth in anger. He put the guns away and told them to do whatever they wanted and announced that they were leaving, much to the surprise of the salesman. The salesman ran after him. Hateful Hate asked and surprised that they would just take it and leave. The bespectacled man adjusted his glasses and said that the leader who spoke on their behalf was actually a much more experienced adventurer than these two. The leader placed a hand on Liang's shoulder, who calmly closed his eyes, and the title team leader was displayed above his head. He said while pointing his finger at Liang that he wasn't that strong unlike him. Changhai tensed up and thought that according to what Zhu Mao had taught him, a true contract master would not allow an adventurer disguised as a novice to enter the dungeon so as not to lose a beer, concluding that it was simply illogical. The leader gave a thumbs-up gesture and told the adventurers to choose. They can act on their own or join them. He explained that those who work alone keep all the profits for themselves, and those who join them will give half of the customs fee to them. Hateful Hate was surprised at how much it was. The fat guy replied with a smile that they only covered half of it, and their goal was to pass the level. He added that the normal fee for newbies was 10% or less, and if they gave half of it, they would still be 90% ahead of the newbies, and told him to stop being stingy. The bespectacled man, trembling and smiling, was surprised that just 2 months after all his accounts were blocked, he would be able to change his life so abruptly. Hateful Hate scratched the back of his head and asked the leader if these were really favorable terms. The leader, with a sinister smile, replied that it was up to them to some extent whether the newcomers could complete the dungeon, and that the reward for completing it would not be long in coming. Hateful Hate asked if just getting half of it meant that he would still get more than most level 7 adventurers after reaching it. The leader, without changing his face, replied that if he did not waste basic resources, he would really succeed. Hateful Hate, a bespectacled man, and a fat guy asked him to let them join them. Walking through the depths of the forest, the salesperson tells Leo that before signing the contract, it was stipulated that it only involves refusing to complete the mission, and it doesn't cover everything else, so they had to finish the mission first. Leo, after a short pause, replied that it was almost done, and they were far away so they didn't need to be followed anymore, and they didn't need to interfere anymore. With a smile, the salesman told him that his acting skills had improved significantly this time, and that he really thought that he believed that he couldn't beat Liang. Leo calmly replied that he really couldn't beat him, which surprised the salesman. He continued that he was still afraid of him, otherwise they wouldn't have tried to negotiate. The salesman smiled nervously and said he understood, asking if he thought they could do it. Leo replied with a grim face that the probability was not too high, and the title of combat expert would not help him, and the leader, despite his charisma, like his friend, is only at the 5th level, and he has no real means to be afraid of. Narrowing his eyes, Leo added that only 1, at most 2, lucky people would be able to get out of this dungeon alive. Throwing his hands behind his head, the salesman doubted, saying that he thought it was the same last time. The leader hands out swords to the adventurers, and they look at them curiously and try them out. The leader says that now that they've decided to work together, he won't hide anything anymore, and said that he can increase the random stat of his teammates who trusted him with their lives. Description of the group leader title effect: 1 charisma +3, to after becoming a leader +1 to all at. Adventurers notice that their stats have increased. Changhai glanced at his status window and noticed that his perception had increased slightly, and realized that the team leader was able to raise the stats of his teammates. The man with glasses turned to the leader, saying that he had a question. He said that the only way they knew of 2 summoned witches was by using the harmonica, and that they were hiding in the lake, and they couldn't complete the task without them. The leader of the security team, picking up a stone from the ground, says that this is not a problem. The bespectacled man says and asks him for more details, and the latter, tossing a rock in his hand, says with a smile that his title allows him to annoy the designated target, and explains that the provocateur loses 2 points of intelligence, becomes vindictive and fearless in the face of death. The fat guy is surprised to note that he is also an adventurer. The provocateur says that to establish a forced dialogue, you just need to attract the attention of the opponent, and with a smile, throws a stone into the lake. The witch peeked out of the water. The leader of the security squad shouts insults at her and shows her 2 middle fingers. The dialogue box says that the second provocateur effect is used. A red dialogue box announces success, and the witch rises from the water, her face contorted with anger. She rushes in his direction, and his smiles glad that the provocation has worked. Liang jumps in front of him and tells him to leave the rest to him. Liang approaches the witch, raising his fist to strike at the witch hanging in the air. The leader yells at the others to spread out and let Liang hold her back and tells them to put on earplugs and spread out around the perimeter. The witch screamed and passed through Liang without taking any damage. The others gritted their teeth in surprise as they noticed what had happened. The witch approached the leader of the guard squad and began to inhale hard. Smiling nervously, he fidgeted. The witch screamed loudly, and the adventurers covered their ears. The force of the sound wave pulling the skin over their faces like a strong wind, and blood gushed out of their noses. Everyone crouched down, except for the leader and the man in the cap and earphones with the long black hair. The witch looked at him questioningly. Getting up from the ground, the fat guy was glad that he was wearing earplugs and said that his nose was bleeding. Standing up, the leader of the security team asked about the fact that the witch was also a ghost. Liang landed on the ground on one foot, and the leader asked if he was sure. Wiping the blood from his nose, he replied that he was sure it would take longer than he thought, and that the monk fist technique they had obtained in the previous dungeon should work, but he wasn't fully used to it yet, so he wouldn't be able to fight at full strength. The leader said that she wasn't that fast, and that he didn't think she could deal much damage to them. He added that he had a hunch that the reward for completing this dungeon would be quite generous. The man in earphones, adjusting his cap, said it was a stupid decision. Changhai turned around and saw a girl walking away from him into the forest and putting on a hood. He asked her why she thought their decision was stupid, and she was surprised, turned around, and thought about how she really met a person with 16 perception points, the chance of meeting with witches 1 in 100,000. He saw the title, They Pretend I Don't Exist, above her head. The dialogue box announced the calculation of 3 title effects, she said, unhappy. Then she vanished into thin air. The dialogue box declared success. The main character looks into space with empty eyes. The fat guy slapped him on the shoulder, asking who he was talking to, and he came to his senses. The guy asked if there was anyone in the direction the main character was looking. And the main character started talking about seeing someone there, wondering if it was a hallucination. Then, he sensed something and announced that someone was coming. To which the guy asked, "Who is coming?" Several witches, identical to the one they are fighting, flew out of the forest. Liang slammed a fist that radiated yellow energy into the witch's stomach, sending her flying backwards. The bespectacled man and Hateful Hate were overjoyed. Liang landed behind the witch, who had fallen to the ground on her knees and was holding her stomach. Noticing the witches approaching, he turned back to where the fat guy and Changhai were standing and shouted to the leader that they were mistaken, and there were more than one witch in this dungeon, and they obviously knew about it in 2 ways. Behind the surprised leader, many witches flew out of the forest. The fat guy opened his mouth in horror. The leader of the security squad chuckled sarcastically, asking if it was too much. The leader stiffened. Changhai clenched his teeth tensely and thought that earplugs would be useless against so many. Liang asked why everyone was frozen and shouted for them to run. The adventurers ran as fast as they could, splitting up in the forest. Hateful Hate runs, waving his arms, one of which is tied with a red thread tied in a bow, and in horror asks why this always happens to him. He remembers lying on the floor with his hand outstretched to a man sitting on the couch with 2 girls with red threads on their shoulders, lying with empty eyes and expressions, a man with a gold necklace around his neck who, smiling broadly, tells him that he thought he should let go. Sticking out his tongue mockingly, he asked who said he enjoyed watching others live their lives in regret, pain, and suffering. This is an ranked criminal, Gao Chengyun, a level 7 adventurer. Hateful Hate turns in horror at the witch approaching him, and in a rage shouts that he has not yet avenged his comrades by swinging his sword. There was an explosion in the forest, throwing up broken trees. Hateful Hate is lying on the ground, a pool of blood under his head. He thinks about how he can die here. A fat guy surrounded by witches brandishes a sword and shouts about whether they know who he is, and says that he is a man who wants to become a legendary adventurer, and shouts at them to get lost. The witches hiss back. The bespectacled man was leaning over the ground in tears, looking at the approaching hissing witches and saying, addressing himself as a mother, that he was wrong and should not have cheated the depositors. Liang is standing in a fighting stance, blood streaming from his eyes, and they are shouting at the witches to attack, and that he is not afraid of them. Behind him, the leader is sitting on the ground with his back against a rock. His eyes and ears are bleeding, and he tells himself to pull himself together. He reflects that it's no wonder the vendor and Liao didn't put a level limit on entering the dungeon, and that they are deliberately luring level 4 to 5 adventurers here to take all the resources after they die. With a look of annoyance on his face, the leader says what a good plan this is. Changhai approaches him and asks if he has any ideas on how they can kill these witches. The leader turned to look at him in surprise, his blooded eyes still closed. Changhai told him to hurry up if he had a plan. Then he said that they had other ways of attacking besides the voice, and that even though their strength wasn't that great, they could still deal a lot of damage. He added that even if he sacrificed his hearing, he wasn't sure he could get out of the. Hearing his voice, the leader asked him if he was a writer from Dongshan, to which the latter replied in the affirmative. The leader replied that he did not expect that he, a novice, would be better than him, and asked how he understood him if he had hearing problems. The main character replied that his perception is equal to 16, and he can read lips. The leader replied that in his opinion, he is no way out, and that these witches were immune to physical attacks, and their resistance to fire, lightning, and strong acids was also surprisingly high, and added that frankly speaking, it wasn't something that a team of adventurers like them could hand. The main character clarified with him that it turns out that he can't do anything. Gritting his teeth and not speaking for long, the leader replied that he could. He explained that in the last dungeon, Liang received a small jar of sacred oil blessed by the monks. Liang screams as he is attacked by the smiling witches, blood pouring from his mouth, ears, and eyes. The leader added that his monk's fist could injure a witch, and the sword bound with sacred oil could also deal damage to them, and said that it was only damage, and that he didn't think a novice adventurer would be able to survive a siege by so many ghosts. Stepping forward, to the leader's surprise, Changhai said that they couldn't just sit idly by. The witches looked at the approaching protagonist in surprise, and shouted at him. The dialogue box announced that he was on the verge of death, and activated the second effect, Strength +4. Dexterity +4. Above the main character, he said that he who was shrouded in dark purple energy, the title Escape Death appeared. The dialogue box reported that the title holder was in the correct physical state. Strength +4, Agility +4, Perception +4. He sat down on the ground behind the Liang and picked it up, holding it under his arm. Changhai asked him if he could hear him, and said that he had asked his companion, who had told him that to pass the dungeon, he had to give him oil. He asked if he agreed. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Liang asked again, "Pass the level?" Then he replied that he seemed to be blind and was afraid that he couldn't control the adventurers panel to get him what he needed. The main character looked at the ground in frustration. Liang then raised a fist glowing with yellow energy and said that he had another way to mine it for him. He slapped his chest and blood spurted out of his mouth. Shocked, Changhai asked what he was doing. As Liang was dying, he thought that it was possible to get the oil after his death. Looking at Liang's body, the protagonist thought that he had a feeling that Liang had made a mistake, and that the oil wasn't worth a person's death. Beside Liang's corpse lay glass, iron, and oil blessed by the monks. He noted that as a result of the effects of his titles, he gained 20 dexterity points, which would be enough for him to escape, even though the chances of survival are not great. Changhai holds a yellow bottle of oil in his hand. The dialogue box announces the receipt of an unknown magic item oil blessed by monks. He poured oil on his sword as the witches swirled around him. He looked at them and said he wouldn't hold back because they were getting on his nerves. The witches got angry and threw an attack on the main character. Changhai stood with his sword in both hands while the witches slashed him with their claws. The dialogue box announced that the sword blessing was open. The following dialogue box explained that this is a magical sacred technique that adds plus to damage to evil creatures. While preparing to attack, Changhai repeated, plus to damage, swinging his sword. His eyes lit up red, and he said, "Then let's get started." The salesman and Liao are standing in front of the entrance to a dungeon in an abandoned construction site. They notice a glow from the portal where the girl with the title comes out. They pretend that I don't exist, and the seller notes that someone still managed to get out, but he doesn't see the person who came out of the portal. Liao, yawning, asks who is there, and if he was mistaken, he replies that he is serious. She thinks that they really do use unsuitable dungeons as traps to lure adventurers there, leave them to die, then collect drops from them, and sometimes even kill the survivors with their own hands. As she stares at her phone, she thinks she knows why they're doing this. Her phone screen shows a chat with her employer, She writes that after an investigation, it turned out that there are problems with the dungeon in which the employer's son died. In the next message, she explained that the advent. Changhai cuts the witch in half with a sword strike. The witch disappears into thin air with a cry. Tired, Changhai falls to the ground and tries to catch his breath. He thinks it was close, and if there were just a few more of them, even a recovery potion wouldn't help him. He turned his attention to the adventurer's panel, where a notice appeared stating that the death dance he performed with the banshee was so beautiful that the passing ruler of death liked it. And he received the gift Undead Can't Kill Me, which will save him from dying at the hands of non-life, and upon discovering his newfound bonus of being immune to death at the hands of the undead, the main character perked up with joy. Deciding that the extra reward is so great that the main rewards and resources pale in front of it, he agrees to close the dungeon. A blue dialog box indicates that the calculation is in progress. The calculation is complete, and the yellow dialog box says, "You, an adventurer of the Z level, we have taken a step towards becoming a legend. New title received. Lone Wolf gets a new title. Wolf in sheep's clothing received a new title. Spirit Killer. Exclusive hidden skills obtained. Dance Why." The leader asked why it was so quiet and if the Dongshin writer was still alive. The main character caught himself, saying that he almost forgot about it. Running up to the leader, he asked him how he was feeling and if he could stand up. Gritting his teeth, he replied that it was hard for him and that the witch's scream had reached his internal organs. Changhai looked at him with a serious but calm gaze and said, "That's how it is." He asked if everyone else was dead. The main character, remembering the dead bodies of adventurers, replied with a sigh that the fat man, the bespectacled man, that man and his comrade are dead. The leader noted that Changhai didn't seem to be in the dungeon for the first time and suggested that his level was very high, as were his stats. Touching a finger to his cheek, he replied that he thought the leader would be the one to sort things out. He replied that he was left all alone and that he would not be able to go to, and asked not to talk about it. He offered to cooperate and said that he would keep his secret, explaining that in exchange for his rewards, he would do the same for him, and asked how he would feel about it. He added that next to the leader of the security team lying on the ground is a bundle of paper signed like a bureau contract. Changhai pointed the sword at the leader and said that the dead leader would also keep his secret perfectly, and then he could keep the contract for himself. The leader replied that he wouldn't be able to get the most out of it, and that the contract was directly related to the mission of this dungeon, asking if he didn't understand that. The main character looked at the leader in silence without removing his sword. The leader said that the vendor and Liao Liao were probably waiting for the survivors at the entrance of the dungeon, and that they were much stronger than he thought. He added that he could divert their attention so that he could fight back or escape, and that letting him out of here alive was the entrance to a dungeon in an abandoned construction site lit up. And when Liao Liao noticed this, he said to notice that someone was coming after all. The salesman, flexing his fists, said that last time he probably really imagined it. Changhai came out of the portal, helping the leader walk. The salesman noticed that the dungeon was collapsing and asked in surprise that they had cleared it out. Behind the leader, a sword appeared in the protagonist's hand, and Liao Liao shouted at the vendor to watch out for it. Changhai, with a serious face and red eyes, charged and pierced the chest of the salesman, causing blood to gush out of his mouth. Glancing nervously at the protagonist, Liao Liao said, with his face covered in the vendor's blood and his eyes glowing red, Changhai turned to him and said that the weaker one should be removed first. The dialogue box says, "Dance with death during danger." The damage dealt is tripled. The next dialogue box says, "One step, one kill, on the edge of life." Changhai stands with a bloody sword over the body of the salesman and turning to Liao Liao with a serious face splattered with blood, says that the weak one is finished. Liao Liao angrily shouted at the main character that he taking a lot of himself. Changhai grinned viciously at him and asked if he thought it was all an empty truth and if he was thinking of taking revenge on him. Liao Liao furiously shouted at him to be quiet and took out a green-bladed poison dagger. Above his head you can see a yellow window with the title, "Run, Cowards." The dialogue box describes the title effect, Speed +2, with the participation of a teammate, Strength +2, Speed +2. Changhai, with the red title Lone Wolf on his head, twirled his sword playfully in his hand as he stood there. Liao Liao, who had taken a fighting stance, was sitting on the floor with his back against the concrete wall. Changhai touched his face with his index finger and mockingly told Liao Liao that he was very scary. They instantly disappeared from their seats. Their movements were so fast that one could only see the sparks from their weapon strikes that flashed all over the place, leaving a white trail behind them. Looking at these sparks, the leader thought that he had seen a lot. But the fight between these two exceeded all his knowledge of level 5 adventurers. He closed his lips tightly and opened wide, thinking that he was afraid that, even among level 7 to 8 adventurers, there weren't many who possessed this kind of speed. He understood why people wonder if every adventurer can become a legend, since many don't even make it to the 5th level. Liao Liao was thrown sideways by the impact, his back hitting a concrete pillar, and blood spurted out of his mouth. He fell to the floor with his hands on the ground and cursed that even with the title, he couldn't match Changhai's speed, and that it was annoying. The main character stares at him motionlessly, holding a bloody sword in one hand. Liao Liao wiped the blood on his face with the sleeve of the hand, holding the green-bladed dagger, and clarified that the main character's perception was at least 17 minutes 18. Changhai smiled smugly as he pointed the sword forward and asked if he understood. Liao Liao gritted his teeth in anger and shouted for the adventurer panel. An interface appeared in front of him and he stuck his hand in. The main character mockingly asked if Tom didn't have enough speed. Liao Liao took out a glass jar with a green liquid inside and, while glaring at the protagonist furiously, he replied that it wasn't enough. Liao Liao threw the jar to the floor. The jar broke, and Liao Liao was surrounded by green gas. The main character looked surprised. Liao Liao raised his hand, surrounded by green gas. The veins on his body bulged and turned green. His eye glowed green, and a purple title could be seen above his head, a toxin transporter. He said that he didn't plan to use it on Changhai, but Changhai left him no choice. Leaving a trail of green gas behind, Liao Liao charged at the protagonist, and the protagonist blocked the dagger with his sword while gritting his teeth. Liao Liao, with a mad smile, told him to taste the mutant spider toxin that he had purchased on the black market. Changhai noticed the green gas surrounding him, the veins on one side of his face and neck bulged, turning green, red capillaries showing in his eye, and he gritted his teeth. Changhai crossed his arms in a block as Liao Liao threw many quick dagger strikes at him, slashing all over his body with blood spurting out. Smiling madly, Liao Liao noticed that Changhai was in the middle of a fight with Liao Liao, and Liao Liao noted that the main character's poison resistance was worse than ordinary people's. As he continued to stab with the dagger, he asked him about how he didn't even have the strength to fight back. The main character, still blocking with his hands, silently gritted his teeth. His eye was green with poison. Changhai swung his sword sharply, but Liao Liao arched his torso backwards and jumped back with a few somersaults. Touching his hand to the floor, he grinned and said that it was too slow and didn't even touch him. Standing in a fighting stance, covered in cuts and green swollen veins on his arm and face, the protagonist asked Liao Liao about the spider venom being something he had prepared for them. Flexing his fists, he replied that he got it after leaving the 7th level spider's den dungeon, and explained that this poison significantly reduces strength, speed, and stamina. Smiling wickedly, Liao Liao held up 5 fingers and said that thanks to him, he was able to get rid of 4 level 5 adventurers, and that Changhai would be the 5th. The main character, looking seriously at his opponent, replied with a smirk that he should have prepared more poison and told him to go back to the main character's dungeon. Liao Liao said that to show what he was capable of. Liao Liao stopped smiling and glared at the protagonist in disbelief. Changhai smiled confidently and continued to provoke him, asking if this was all he had. The latter, looking at him seriously, replied that this was not all. He shouted, grinning madly as he pointed the bloody dagger towards Changhai, saying that since he holds the title of a toxin carrier, everything, including his breath, the sweat on his skin, and the blood that flows in his veins, is all poison. He said that the longer it was around him, the deeper. Looking at Liao Liao, the leader thought that this was a very creepy tactic, and even Liang, being a martial arts expert, wouldn't be able to beat him. He was thinking that if he couldn't finish the battle before the poison was absorbed, then it would be much harder to do so later. He added that gritting his teeth and holding his hand on his shoulder, the leader remarked that it was no wonder that Liao Liao and his companions treated them like trash, since with this, you can defeat anyone. Changhai said that he realized that the title Escape Death was visible above his head, and he called up the adventurer panel, much to Liao Liao's surprise. He pressed a few buttons on the panel, saying that he also wanted to look at something. 5 blue dialogue boxes appeared in front of him and said, "Thanks to the skill 1 step 1 kill, the adventurer gets the opportunity to calculate the next step of the enemy. Death Evader effect activated strength, agility, perception +4, T features improved, poisoning the poison will weaken. Changhai calmly said to turn off the Dance with Death skill. The panel announced that the poison damage was removed and the Dance with Death is normal. Liao Liao was surprised to find that the main character had disappeared right before his eyes. Changhai appeared right in front of Liao Liao, striking out with his sword, and Liao Liao had a hard time blocking his dagger strike, caught off guard. Gritting his teeth, Liao Liao said that it was impossible and asked how he had achieved such speed. Changhai smiled ominously and asked if he understood. The main character instantly appeared behind Liao Liao and slashed his back with his sword, causing him to cry out. He turned around angrily, brandishing his dagger, and shouted at him not to be conceited. Liao Liao quickly stabbed the dagger in front of him, but there was no one there. Changhai was behind him and said with a serious face that he was too slow to reach him that way. Liao Liao gritted his teeth in rage, shouting that it was impossible because Changhai was a normal lone wolf and asking how he could be stronger than Liao Liao. Changhai was surprised to find that Liao Liao if he had defeated a bunch of level 5 adventurers. The protagonist pierced Liao Liao's chest from behind with his sword, and blood gushed out from his wound. Liao Liao screamed in pain. Changhai put his face close to Liao Liao's ear and told him that nothing was impossible and that he, wrapped in comfort, would never see the scenery that one who walks on the edge between life and death sees. To the protagonist's surprise, Liao Liao grabbed the sword blade protruding from his chest with his hand. He turned to face the main character and said with a serious face that often those who can swim will stay alive. Liao Liao was surprised to find that he had not been able to reach Liao Liao's chest, and that he was still drowned, and he won't get very far if he doesn't change his strategy, he explained. Changhai told him with a serious face that it might work for ordinary people, but for those who had already been on the edge, death wasn't the only option. He forcefully took out the sword from Liao Liao's chest, and blood gushed out profusely. Liao Liao fell to the ground in a pool of his own blood. The leader thought in surprise that Changhai had defeated such a strong man. He was surprised when the main character turned in his direction. Changhai smiled slightly and put his index finger to his lips, telling him to be quiet. Yingzi Hospital, the main character is lying in a hospital bed, looking at the phone. Blue title is visible above his head. Ju Mao entered the room, telling him that he was a lucky guy. The main character sat up in bed, asking why he was here. Ju Mao explained as he got closer the protagonist that when he first entered the dungeon, he encountered monsters that were immune to physical attacks, and the exit was blocked by scavenger vultures. Changhai replied with a smile that he received the title of Death Incarnate. Ju Mao sat down on the next bunk, crossed his legs, and told him with a smile not to forget that there is misfortune next to luck. He asked the main character how often level 5 adventurers encounter opponents that surpass them in strength. Ju Mao held up his index finger and advised him not to reveal his title to others because leaking information is disastrous for an adventurer, and it's not just monsters that adventurers should be wary of in dungeons. Aquously, Changhai scratched the back of his head and said that he would remember. Looking at the main character with a smile and a cold look, Ju Mao reflects that although the owner of the Banshee dungeon was declared dead by other survivors, but he can hardly believe that a person with his fighting skills and level was able to go through all this alone. The smile faded from Ju Mao's face. He watched the main character press a button on the adventurer panel and remove his title. Looking up in surprise, Changhai turned to him and asked if there was anything on his face. Ju Mao, getting up from his bunk, said no, and explained that he just remembered that the coach was coming back at the end of the month. As he approached the door of the ward, he told him to remember to return to training when he recovered from his injuries and that he would soon move on to the next stage. The main character agreed, and Ju Mao left the ward. Changhai glanced at the empty cot next to him. He remembers asking the leader, who was lying on a nearby coin, at night that he no longer plans to be an adventurous strategist. The leader, putting his hands behind his head, replied that this trip made him realize that he can't become a legendary adventurer, and in a group of people, he can't be a. He opened one eye. The leader looked at the main character and said that he was not like that, and he had potential due to his ruthlessness. Changhai asked with a smile why he was saying that. The leader replied with a smile that although the Lone Wolf title gave him a lot of privileges, it was all limited to the 10th level of the dungeon, and as for the 11 to 15 levels, his strength would not be enough. He explained that if he wants to become a legend, he needs to create his own team before he reaches the 10th level. Otherwise, he will be stuck at level 11 to 15 or be banned and lose all his opportunities. Changhai lies alone in a hospital room during the day, hands behind his head, and thinks about the team. Coffee house. A hooded girl is sitting at the same table as a man in glasses and a business suit who is pulling something out of his jacket. He put two photographs on the table and said that the vultures who had killed his son were dead and their killer was among the survivors. This man is a rich man from Fujian, Cao Huang. He is a man who has been in the business for a long time, and he has been in the business for a long time. He asked her who she thought was the benefactor who had helped avenge his son. She silently glanced at the photos and pointed at Changhai's photo. Morgue, Yingxiao Hospital. Box number 26 is shrouded in blue energy. A blue portal appears on it with a dialogue box that says, Dungeon 16, 28, 22. The next day, Changhai, dressed in white hospital clothes, sits on a bench outside. Someone called his name, and he turned questioningly. Two guys in t-shirts with sinister smiles were standing in front of him. The guy with the dark hair told him that he was Changhai, who was in the banshee forest. The blonde-haired guy was flexing his fists. The guy with dark hair is a level 5 adventurer from the Bad Fist Brothers Company from Yingxiao. He smiled unpleasantly, said that they were very interested in the items he had received, and asked what he could offer them. Changhai calmly crossed his arms and said that the items were not for sale. The dark-haired guy paled in anger, and the blonde-haired guy laughed, saying that he thought they were on a business proposition. Changhai looked at them intently. A guy with dark hair sat down very close to the main character, putting his arm around his neck and, smiling maliciously, asked him to rephrase. He told him to give him what he found there. Changhai calmly pulled his head away from the other's face. The guy demanded to do it quickly, threatening T. A nurse wearing round glasses with two black pigtails appeared in front of them and shouted at them to get out and don't dare disturb their patients. The dark-haired man stood up and called for his companion to leave. The blonde-haired guy scratched his head in exasperation. They left, and Changhai and the nurse watched them go. The nurse, with a serious face, with her hand on her chest, told the protagonist to tell her right away the next time they bothered him and explained that her brother was a level 10 adventurer and they wouldn't go against her. Changhai smiled awkwardly and thanked her. She started shaking his hand and said that she should thank him. Changhai stared back at her in disbelief. Tears welled up behind her round glasses, and she said that her friend had died in that dungeon, and Changhai had dealt with the villains who had killed him, and that she and her friend's family were extremely grateful to him. Changhai replied with a smile. Who would have thought it? The dialogue box on the morgue crate showed that the timer had reached 0, and the portal burst with blue energy. The entire hospital building was shrouded in blue energy. The nurse started to say something, but suddenly disappeared into thin air, leaving a blue holographic trail. Changhai opened his mouth in surprise. Jumping up from the bench, he found people disappearing around him in the ground shrouded in blue energy. He shouted that it was a phenomenon of capturing people after a dungeon rampage. He was surprised to find that it had also started to disappear, shrouded in blue squares. He disappeared and found himself sitting on the ground. He rubbed the back of his head, complaining that it hurt. Looking in front of him, he froze in surprise when he saw, along with the other people who were accidentally dragged into the dungeon, a landscape with a head of land covered with tombstones all the way to the horizon. The dialogue box says, Cemetery, Level 5, current applicants 20 out of 20, exit conditions, kill 100 skeleton soldiers, special conditions, survive for an hour. The crowd of people was surrounded by tombstones. The nurse, adjusting her glasses, shouted at them not to panic and explained that they were trapped in an entry-level dungeon. She asked them to open the adventurer panel and confirm the mission. She was hugging a frightened little boy, and people were looking at her with worried expressions. The guy with blue hair and shaved temples on the back of his head is the manager of the Yangzhou Adventurer Association, Judah. He held his cheek, clenching his teeth tightly, and thought about how he had come to treat a tooth and ended up in a dungeon. Changhai tensely said, expand the panel. A dialogue box appeared in front of him, and he noticed in shock that this was a level 5 dungeon and a lot of people might die. A branch of the Yangzhou Adventurers Association, the man asks in surprise that people were dragged into the dungeon at Yangzhou Hospital and 20 people just disappeared. This is Cheng Lei, the hiring manager of the Yangzhou Adventurer Association, a level 9 adventurer. He is dressed in a business suit with a red tie and has short black hair. He asks in surprise, saying on the phone that Judah is also with them. A crowd of people surrounds the hospital building, covered with police tapes. Changhai enters the hospital grounds with a man and a woman in business suits. He asks a man in a brown suit with a paper in his hand, "What's going on?" He replies that there are 17 civilians and 3 adventurers on the missing persons list. He said that they had found the entrance to the dungeon and said, but Changhai tensely asked him what he meant. People in the dungeon discuss what their missions are by looking at the adventurers' panels. They agreed that they all had the same mission to kill 10 skeletons and hold out for an hour. Bad Fist Brothers is also here. The guy with the blonde hair addressing the guy with the dark hair says that He gave Changhai a cold look and said that he needed to find him after they dealt with everything else, and that there were too many people here right now to just get close to him. The blonde-haired guy agreed. Changhai raises his hand and shouts to the people around him to listen. Changhai put his foot on a rock and, while holding a sword stuck in the ground in his other hand, shouted about how this dungeon was extremely dangerous and told the others to pick up the weapons they saw on the ground, break up into groups of 3 to 5 people, and try to complete their exit missions as. A guy with a shaved head with a smile asked the main character who he was, that he was giving orders here. The beefy guy in the blue shirt grinned and said that he thought he was doing this to steal their resources, the treasures of the dungeon. Due to the influence of adventurers who have become media personalities, many people think that there are hidden treasures in the dungeons, with which you can jay. The main character shouted in shock that this dungeon was really extremely dangerous. He was thinking that the two of them must have gone mad and were arguing with him without knowing anything about the dangers of the dungeon. The nurse pointed her index finger at Changhai and shouted that he was quite a strong adventurer who had escaped from a very dangerous dungeon a few days ago. She explained that he had teamed up with other adventurers to deal with the people who were forcing newcomers into the dungeon and taking tea. Changhai thought that even though it wasn't entirely true, it would be enough to attract attention. Suda asked if this dungeon is really as dangerous as the dungeon entrance, and he replied that it is. He really thinks that ordinary people like them will be able to complete the quest and get out. He added that killing skeletons is very difficult, and that if everyone listens to him and breaks up into groups, then everything will end up with the younger ones joining together, and the old ones and those who are weaker will be left out of business. He asked if he was even thinking about what woe. Suda chuckled viciously, thinking that his brother-in-law was right to hire him to incite fools like these, and that he could only rely on a tongue-in-cheek attitude to get the experienced adventurers to protect him. He looks at the main character with a grin, thinking that if he thinks for a moment about the lives of all these people, he will immediately turn into their nanny. Changhai exhaled and turned to the nurse and the little boy next to her, and asking if they believed him. They nodded back. He turned and went, calling them to come with him, and said that he could let them pass the mission. The nurse agreed and ran after him, holding the little boy's hand. Judah furiously asked who allowed him to leave. The main character stopped without turning back. Judah, with a smug smile, loudly said that as the only adventurer present with experience in such dungeons, he should stay and protect them. People shouted to him that with great power comes great responsibility, and that he must fulfill their missions as well. Changhai calmly replied that he wasn't officially an adventurer, so he didn't have any responsibility for their safety. The nurse and Judah were surprised. Judah looked at him questioningly, tensing up. The main character turned to him with a threatening face, his eyes burning red, and said that there was no need to appeal to his moral principles, and that he would break his leg without hesitation and leave him here to fight for his life. Judah fell to the ground in shock. People shouted after Changhai and the nurse with the little boy left, asking why he was acting like this, and shouldn't people protect those who are weaker. Another voice in the crowd shouted that he probably didn't become an official adventurer because of his low morale. One of the people in the crowd turned around and noticed the Bad Fist brothers leaving, and asked where they were going. The dark-haired guy replied that they thought he was right, and that since one of the exit rules was survival for 1 hour, they would have a hard time, and for ordinary people, the right thing to do would be to complete their missions and get out of here as soon as possible. Turning away, the guy chuckled, thinking about who would agree to be someone's bodyguard for the sake of some kind of morality, adding that they were not fools. At the same time, Changhai and a few people are standing in front of the door in the hospital building, which gave off a strong blue energy. Changhai stared at her, his teeth clenched in surprise. The girl behind him, shielding her hand from the door, asked what was wrong with this dungeon. Gritting his teeth, Changhai replied that the question wasn't what was wrong with him, but how many people would still be alive after that hour. The blue dialogue box shows a countdown that showed 53 minutes and 14 seconds, and a survivor counter that showed 20 out of 20. The blow severed the skeleton skull. The dialogue box says, exit mission progress 1 out of 100, remaining time 50 minutes 36 seconds. Changhai stands with the sword that he just used to chop off the skeleton's head. Behind him is a nurse with a baby. He handed her the sword and told her to just repeat after him. He explained that she needed to use this sword to cut open the skeleton's neck when it started crawling out of the grave. The nurse opened her mouth in surprise and took the sword from his hand. She asked, "And you?" She was surprised to find 3 skeletons crawling out of the ground. Changhai looked at them calmly. He opened the adventurer's panel, and an axe appeared in his hand. He said he'd look into it. The light guy from Bad Fist Brothers, grinning, smashed the skeleton with a punch. The dark-haired boy yawned, covering his mouth with his hand, while his companion happily beat up the skeletons. With an expressionless face, he told the blonde-haired guy to remember to switch with him when he was done with this game. He agreed. Changhai cut the skeleton in half with an axe strike along its spine. Around the main character, there were piles of skeletal bones on the ground. Changhai wiped the sweat from his forehead with his hand, and a purple dialogue box with the title Undead Slayer can be seen above his head. Title effect, Charisma -2, Damage +2. He thought about how the skeletons had stopped appearing, and it didn't seem like there were an infinite new. Changhai turned to the nurse and the boy, who were holding swords in their hands, and said that they had destroyed all the skeletons and that they could move on. The nurse agreed. People are fighting with skeletons around Jowda, who was just standing there with a sword. Looking around tensely, he shouted for the wounded to retreat, while the others split up into pairs and take turns killing the skeletons crawling out of the ground. He added that they had only 40 minutes to hold out, and they would be free. The crowd agreed. 10 minutes later, the ground of the cemetery is littered with the bones of fallen skeletons. The guy in a white t-shirt, holding a sword in his hand, stretches his arms and says that, fortunately, the job of an adventurer was not as difficult as he thought. The guy in the purple shirt scratched his head and said that these skeletons weren't as scary as that guy said. Jowda gritted his teeth in anger as he cursed at these two guys, thinking that just because these skeletons were weak didn't mean that the difficulty of the dungeon was low. On the contrary, if the skeletons weren't strong enough, it was an indicator that there was someone more terrifying in the D. Looking at the adventurer's panel dialogue, he thought that the resources were far less than he had expected, even though he had managed to persuade the adventurers to help, or rather, he had used the old men and the weaker ones to force the adventurers to help. He had only killed 4 skeletons out. He started chewing on his thumbnail nervously and thought that it was fine if he could finish 10 minutes before the end of time. But if not, there would definitely be more skeletons here, and he had to find a way to kill the remaining 6 skeletons as soon as possible. The dialogue box shows that the main character took out the axe point from the skeleton skull. After exhaling and placing the axe on his shoulder, Changhai asked the nurse if their missions were completed. The boy, smiling happily, answered in the affirmative. He glanced at the nurse and asked her how much she had left. She opened her mouth nervously and, awkwardly touching her index finger to her cheek and smiling, replied that it was 8. He assumed that she had been helping the boy all along. Putting his hand in his pocket, he told the boy to come back while they continued cleaning up the skeletons. He offered to meet them outside when they were done. The boy agreed. Blue energy radiated from behind the double hospital doors. Changhai shouted that in 10 years, no one had been able to pass this dungeon on their own. He gritted his teeth and said that the dungeon was very large, as well as the number of people who were drawn there, and that almost everyone there was a novice. The girl next to him was looking at him in surprise. She worriedly asked where such an abnormal dungeon came from, and shouldn't the difficulty be related to the strength and experience of adventurers? Changhai stiffly replied that it was all about one mechanism of this dungeon, the grave of an experienced fighter. He explained that the mission difficulty for newbies is only 1/10 that of experienced adventurers, and when newbies complete their tasks and exit the dungeon boss appears, whose strength greatly exceeds the limit that adventurers can handle, and opens a hunt for them, killing most. Changhai thought that the essence of this dungeon was that once the first contestant left the dungeon, a real race for survival would begin. The boy confirms in the dialogue box that he wants to leave the dungeon. He waved to the main character and the nurse and said goodbye to them. They returned the greeting with a smile. The boy disappeared, leaving a trail of blue squirt. Changhai turned to the nurse and said that he would kill a couple of skeletons for her, and said that they would meet outside once they completed her mission. The nurse agreed. The portal in the hospital begins to glow, and those present notice that someone has completed a mission. A small boy comes out of the portal, which shocks Changhai and the guy with the girl behind him. The blue dialogue box says, "Adventurer 20 has left the graveyard dungeon. The second stage begins." Looking at the dialogue boxes in front of them, people in the crowd are surprised that someone has already left. Express envy and fear. Changhai asks what the second stage is. Yunda stares at the dialogue box in surprise, thinking that the essence of this dungeon is a race for survival. And what will happen now? He called out to the guys in the white t-shirt and purple shirt like Lu Ming and Wang Jiahe and told them to follow him. They looked back at him questioningly. The blonde guy from Bad Fist Brothers told his companion that someone had already completed a mission and left the dungeon, and asked him if he thought it was Changhai Lei. The dark-haired guy said it was impossible because he was wearing a nurse and a baby, and it wasn't easy to find 100 stuff. The blonde-haired guy scratched his head, asking who it was. The dark-haired boy turned in surprise and saw a silhouette on the cliff. On the cliff was a knight in dark spiked armor, sitting on a ghostly blue horse clad in similarly spiked armor. This is the Death Knight Claude with an unknown difficulty level. Yunda, Lu Ming, and Wang Jian walk among the tombstones. The guy in the white t-shirt asked the guy in the purple shirt if it was okay for him to ask them to come with him, but he didn't explain anything. He added that they had traveled quite far, and if they met a large group of skeletons with the three of them, they would be in trouble. He replied that he probably had a reason, and pointed out that he had called them after seeing that the panel had changed. Turning to Yunda's side, he said that he was afraid that he knew more about what was going on in the dungeon than they did. They found that Yunda had stopped walking. In front of him, a crowd of skeletons crawls out of the ground. Weapons appeared in their hands, and Yunda told them to get ready. A voice in the crowd asks about the fact that the three of them never returned, and another tells him that he doesn't care about them. Another voice said that they shouldn't have refused that adventurer's help. Another said that if he hadn't left, many of them would have already made it out. A who-fess. The guy with the shaved head was horrified to see the severed heads of the Bad Fist Brothers. Their heads hung from the belt of Claude, who was sitting on his horse. At the same time, Wang Jiahe stands in a rage, blood gushing out from his severed arm. He curses Judah and Lu Ming, asks what they are doing. Judah and Lu Ming run away, while a crowd of skeletons surround Wang Jian. Judah asks Lu Ming how much time he had left as he ran. He opened the adventurer's panel and answered. Judah said that just a little more, and they needed to find a smaller skeleton group, and then they would be fine. Lu Ming shouted that something was wrong and the number of survivors was decreasing, and something had happened in the camp. They stopped and looked back, and Judah asked what he was saying. Changhai and the nurse fight off the skeletons with their backs to each other. The nurse asked the main character what the second phase was. Changhai, chopping off the head of the skeleton in front of him, replied that perhaps the difficulty would increase or stronger monsters would appear. He told her not to worry about it, and asked if she had completed the mission. She said she was going to take a look while opening the adventurer panel. She opened her mouth in surprise when she saw the dialogue box and shouted to the main character that something had happened, and there were 4 of them left, and all the others were dead. Claude stands on a horse with a spear in his hand, surrounded by the bloody bodies of adventurers. Claude looked towards the horizon and said, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. He charged forward on his horse, announcing that he would go to the left. Judah shouts that the dungeon boss has appeared, and if Lu Ming wants to survive, they must stick together and complete the mission before he finds them. Lu Ming furiously shouted that this was nonsense, asking how they could manage this mission together if they couldn't even manage it together with Wang Jai. Judah asked if he could understand the human language and shouted that they didn't have much time left to find the skeletons. Claude came into view, galloping towards them. He swung his spear, and they saw him coming. Claude announced that he was now going to move to the right. Judah looked at the spear in fear and begged his mother for help. Claude chopped off its head with a single swipe of his spear. Changhai puts on a suit of armor while sitting on the ground and asks the nurse if she's finished. Almost, she noted. The sword severed the head of the skeleton lying on the ground. The nurse, leaning on the sword with her hand, wipes the sweat from her forehead. She turned to Changhai, who was putting on steel gloves, and happily announced that she had completed the mission. The main character turned to her with a smile and told her to drop the sword and leave. His eyes tightened in surprise. Behind the nurse, who started to say something with her, with a puzzled face, Claude swung his spear at her. Changhai charged forward tensely, yelling at her to duck, a weapon appearing in his hand. Activated professional skill dance with death, strength +4, agility +4. The nurse looked around in surprise at the spear approaching her head. The main character managed to block Claude's blow with a green-bladed dagger before it reached the nurse. Claude stared at him in silence, his eyes completely red. Changhai was surprised to see that his dagger was breaking. The force of the impact sent the protagonist and the nurse flying backwards. The blue dialogue box says, "Sword strength reduced to 0." Changhai landed and looked in the direction of Claude approaching him. He noted its power as he stood in the clearing cloud of dust. A red dialogue box appeared, warning that the adventurer had encountered a dungeon boss. 5 more red dialogue boxes appeared in front of him, stating that the title Deathwalker had been activated. Perception increased to 18, and the hidden skill 1 step, 1 kill had been activated. Title Awakened after death, dexterity, strength, and perception +4. The adventurer will have a C. Gritting his teeth, Changhai asked the nurse if she had heard him, and told her to leave immediately. She shouted that she understood, and that she would be waiting for him outside, and he had to survive. The nurse disappeared, leaving a trail of blue squares. Changhai took the sword stuck in the ground in his hand, standing in front of Claude. He took up a fighting stance, grabbing the sword with both hands, and said with a grin that it was finally just the two of them, and that he didn't think he would let it down so easily. Claude was looking at him with an unwaveringly serious gaze. The dialogue box says, "Challenge level 5. Number of survivors 1 out of 18. Number of exited 2. Exit conditions kill 100 skeleton soldiers 63 out of 100. Special conditions survive for an hour 15 minutes and 7 seconds left." Cheng Lei, the girl and man who came with him, and the boy who came out of the dungeon saw a nurse coming out of the portal. The boy called out happily. The girl walked over to the nurse, putting her arm around her and helping her walk, and asked if there were any other survivors there. She said there was. Changhai and Claude exchanged quick weapon strikes, blocking each other's attacks. Claude swung his spear from above, and the protagonist gritted his teeth, cursed, and blocked the sword strike in front of his neck. Holding his sword with one hand on the hilt and the other on the blade, he gritted his teeth and thought that he couldn't go on like this because he was no match for Claude in strength and speed. And even if he could predict Claude's next move, at this rate, he would soon collapse from exhaustion. Changhai watched in disbelief as Claude moved his weapon away from his sword. Claude swung his spear again, and the protagonist gritted his teeth as he realized that the matter was bad, and he could neither dodge his attack nor block them. Claude's spear struck the protagonist's side, and he was sent flying back by the force of the impact. Claude chuckled viciously. He told the main character, who was sitting on the ground, leaning on his sword, that with such a difference in strength, he was only able to hold on for so long thanks to his tricks, and it was amazing. Changhai looked up at him, blood coming out of his nose and mouth. He noticed that the man was talking to him, and he was looking at him with a very serious look. The protagonist gritted his teeth, thinking that he needed to think about what he should do. He looked towards Claude, who was approaching at a slow pace, and thought about how he definitely wouldn't let him live. The clock with the pause button showed 5, 3. Cheng Lei announced with a tense face that it was over. He said to summarize the situation for his colleagues in Jiangzhou and report that only 2 of the 17 civilians had survived, and there were no survivors among the 3 adventurers. The boy was holding on to the nurse, who was standing there with a worried expression of fear. She called out to him, asking if it was too early to draw such conclusions, adding that it had only been 5 minutes. The boy agreed with her. Cheng Lei stopped them with a hand gesture and said that he understood their feelings, but asked them to remove their rose-colored glasses. He glanced at the dungeon entrance and said that he wasn't sure if a level 9 adventurer would be able to defeat the boss that was in that dungeon, much less alone. He explained that even if he was the best level 5 adventurer, he wouldn't be able to last that long, and that it had been 5 men. They imagined Claude piercing the protagonist's body through with his spear. The nurse fell to her knees in shock. She held her head and said it was their fault, because if they hadn't slowed him down, he would have gotten out of there alive long ago. The boy looked at her with concern. Cheng Lei looked at them with dislike, thinking that it was their fault, because if Changhai didn't help them, Judah would most likely have left this dungeon forever. He gritted his teeth in anger and clicked his tongue. When he left, he said that he was going to smoke and gave the man and girl in suits a task to take care of these guys. The girl asked what they should do with the dungeon entrance while Changhai took a cigarette out of the pack with his teeth. He turned to her with an evil look and replied that when such low-level entrances get out of control, they pull people in, and after everyone who is pulled in dies, the entrance will close for half an hour and then reappear in a random place. He explained that the Asakation's internal training manual clearly spelled out what to do in such cases and told them to deal with the survivors. The rest would resolve itself. As he left, he said that if they cared so much about it, they could wait for the outcome. The girl agreed. Claude is holding his spear, which has Changhai hanging from it, pierced through the chest. The main character has a broken sword in his hand, and blood is coming out of the wound. Chuckling, Claude tells him that he's good. Changhai said nothing. Claude swung his spear to throw it to the side, and it fell to the ground. Raising the spear to his head with one hand, he said that he was looking forward to it joining him when he turned into a ghost. The spear in Claude's hand turns into a sword, shrouded in purple energy. Turning around, Claude swung his sword in front of him, and a purple portal opened up in front of him. He and his horse entered it. Lying motionless on the ground, Changhai noted that his plan had worked, and thought about how his body was valuable to Claude and how he needed to use the gift of death before he returned. The protagonist's eyes begin to close. The blue dialogue box says, "Hint advice to the host to use the gift 'The dead can't kill me.'" The following dialogue box reported that death immunity was activated. The wound on Changhai's chest closed up. He is lying on the ground, wrapped in a brilliant pink energy. A dungeon of unknown level, the kingdom of the Lord of Bones. A purple portal appears among the trees and dead trees, and Claude comes out with his horse. He tensed as he saw a dark purple blob of energy that flying across the sky towards him. A blue-skinned man in black robes landed in front of him. A guy with white hair, pointy ears with cross-shaped earrings and stitches on his mouth scratched his head and asked Claude why he was here if he was sent to the cemetery. The legendary creature is a harbinger of the night, challenge level 16. He thought about how it was a waste of time, and he thought that he was here at the invitation of the Lord of Bones. Claude put away his sword and said that he had encountered a newbie adventurer and that making him a mere skeleton would be too wasteful, and he wanted to ask the Overlord for the Black Knight crown to send him to the reserve. Harbinger of Night scratched his head, grinned, and said that if he remembered correctly, access to the graveyard only opens at the 5th level, and previously beginners regardless of title did not get there. He asked if he was confident that he would become a legend. Changhai propped himself up with a hand on his chest and said that it really was too risky, and if Claude hadn't left on his own initiative, even with the extra life, he wouldn't have had a chance. He paid attention to the dialogue boxes and noticed that it says that a special condition is met, and asked why there is no exit window from the dungeon. Frowning, he realized that without completing the skeleton quest, he wouldn't be able to get out. Taking out his sword, the protagonist said to hurry up, before Claude realized that he was still alive. Half an hour later, the nurse and the boy look at the entrance to the dungeon, and she shouts that the entrance is not closed, which means that Changhai is still fighting, and he is still alive. The girl in the suit shouted that she would call the boss. Changhai is sitting on the stairs and smoking a cigarette. He thinks with a tense face that she died in the dungeon, and her sister will definitely blame the survivors for everything. A girl in a suit called out to him from the stairs above, and he looked at her questioningly. He asked me what the panic was about. The girl shouted that the entrance to the dungeon still hadn't closed, even though the time was long out. Changhai opened his mouth in surprise. Changhai stands surrounded by the bones of fallen skeletons. Breathing heavily, he opens the adventurer panel. The dialogue box says, "Relationship resolution." Friendly reminder, some issues need to be resolved separately. The main character says that he wants to try and clicks on the confirmation button. The dialogue box indicates that the calculation is underway. A yellow dialogue box appears in front of it, which says, "Payment completed." In Liu at level 4 managed to survive in the hands of a legendary spirit, even though, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, Changhai notes that the boss name is Claude, and he has a legendary level. He thought that if he remembered correctly, creatures of this level were only found in the corresponding dungeons, and wondered where such a boss would come from in the 5th level graveyard. He pressed the button, confirming his desire to leave the dungeon. Changhai looked at the dungeon entrance in surprise. The girl pointed at him and asked him to look at it. She asked if this meant that low-level dungeons continued to exist even after there were no survivors left. Changhai replied with a tense face that there were two options. First, an adventurer who was involved in the dungeon completed the main task, but not the escape task, and second, an improved dungeon. The nurse, hands clasped in front of her, shouted that this was probably the first option. The boy supported her and shouted that this was the first option. The boy supported her and shouted that this was the first option. Changhai replied that it was impossible because the graveyard had long been defined by the World Adventurer Association as practically impossible to pass, and that he believed that something inside the dungeon itself had somehow af. The entrance to the dungeon began to glow, and the boy happily shouted that someone was coming out. Changhai walked out of the portal with a questioning expression on his face. The nurse happily shouted that it was indeed Changhai. There are tears of joy in her eyes. Changhai scratched his head and calmly noted that they were still here. Changhai clenched his teeth in rage, thinking about what kind of tricks this was. A nurse with a worried face told the protagonist that they were worried to death about him, and if he didn't manage to get out of the dungeon because of her, she would feel guilty for the rest of her life. Changhai scratched his head and replied that it wasn't that bad. Looking at them with a serio. Castle of the Lord of Bones. In a wide room, a dark silhouette sits on a throne that stands on a raised platform. Claude is standing in front of him, propped up on one knee. The Lord of Bones noted that it was the first time Claude had decided to meet him since he sent him to the graveyard. The Lord of the Rings turned out to be a skeleton with long white hair, clad in golden armor, a crown, and a red robe. His trial level is unknown, and his eyes glow red in their empty sockets. Meeting room. Changhai is sitting next to the association secretary in charge of recording the conversation between the dungeon supervisor and Changhai. Who cleared the dungeon? Folding his hands in front of him, Changhai asks with a smile if Changhai knows that he was the first adventurer in TH. Changhai, who was wearing his usual black t-shirt and glasses, pointed at himself with an awkward smile and asked if he was the person in question. Flipping through the papers, Changhai replies that everything is correct, and although the level of the dungeon is not very high, this location is very well known in the circle of adventurers. He said that Changhai's achievement surely attracted big finances and an influx of people. Grinning, he added that the government would be interested. Smiling awkwardly and rubbing his cheek with his index finger, Changhai clarified that he should apply now. After slamming a stack of papers on the table, Changhai replied in the affirmative and said that Changhai's performance in the cemetery and banshee forest proved that he definitely had potential, and there were no more than 10 such talented newcomers in Fujian province. Changhai grinned ominously and said that he, as the person in charge, couldn't let him go. Changhai's face twisted nervously. The boy and the nurse are waiting in the hallway. The boy asks, sitting on the floor, why Changhai hasn't come out yet, and suggested that they want to deprive him of the reward for completing the dungeon. The nurse looked surprised, jumping to his feet, but asking why then. Changhai asked Changhai to talk to him alone. The nurse rubbed her chin, looking up, and said it was unlikely. Changhai furiously replied that he wasn't that kind of person, and the boy turned around in surprise. Changhai put his hand on his belt and raised an eyebrow as he said that he didn't need any loot from the level 5 dungeon. Behind him, Changhai smiled awkwardly as he scratched the back of his head. Folding his arms and covering one eye, the boy replied that even if Changhai didn't need him, it didn't mean that his relatives didn't need him. Changhai gritted his teeth in anger. Changhai ruffled the boy's hair and smilingly told him not to talk nonsense and explained that they were delayed because they were discussing him joining the Adventurers Association. The boy frowned and asked him if he really wanted to work for the state. Changhai smiled awkwardly and rubbed his cheek with his index finger, suggesting that he had a problem with it. The boy replied that he just thought that a strong man like Changhai could provide for himself, and there was no need for him to obey the rules of the association like Wang Zijian. Sean Burger Joint, the main character, a boy and a nurse are sitting at a table with trays of food. The boy jumps up, asks Changhai if he is really the author of The Immortal Adventurer, and shouts that it can't be. Changhai smiled smugly and adjusted his glasses, saying that if he didn't believe him. Changhai turned his attention to the nurse, who was looking down with a face like she was about to cry. He asked her what had happened. She awkwardly asked if it was possible for him not to join the association. Changhai wondered why. She replied worriedly that she once overheard her brother talking to his friends, and it's not like he's going to be able to do. It seems that most of the people who joined the association later regretted their decision. Changhai asked if her brother had said why. She replied with an even more worried face that she hadn't spoken, but she remembered the expressions on their faces when they discussed it, and that joining the association was their biggest mistake. The main character paused for a moment. He smiled and said he would think about it, thanking her for her concern. The nurse replied that she should be the one to thank. The cup shattered on the floor. A red-haired woman in an expensive coat points her finger at Changhai and shouts at him that Changhai is the author of The Immortal Adventurer 2. Changhai refused to help her brother, but Changhai decided to accept him anyway. Cursing at him, she asked him if he had forgotten exactly how he had managed to get this position. This woman is the daughter of the deceased legendary adventurer Ju Chong and the wife of Changhai. He looked at her with a serious face, holding a lit cigarette in his hand. He replied that he hadn't forgotten and that he had invited him to join them for a reason. He explained that the dungeon he had cleared was special, and in a few days, his name would be known to everyone. And if he agreed to. He added that if he signed a contract with them, then she herself knows what will be waiting for him after reaching the 15th level. Enraged, the girl replied that it was too long, even if he had the potential, and that it didn't mean that he would be able to reach level 15 and become a legendary 8 of it. Sitting up in his chair, Changhai replied that he understood. He stubbed out his cigarette and said they'd just get rid of him. Apartment, night. In a dark room, a guy with long, disheveled black hair is sitting at a computer. On its screen is a message stating that the sender has valuable information about the cemetery. In the next message, the interlocutor says that the offer will be valid for about 3 days and asks how much they will be. The guy raised an eyebrow, looked up thoughtfully, chewed on his fingernail, and asked aloud if the information about this place hadn't been known for a long time. This is the hacker and purveyor of dungeon information, Lao Wang. He wrote a reply message asking for a hint because he wants to find Changhai, who was sitting at his laptop, calmly turned to Ju Cheng and said that was all. The girl leaned over her laptop, still looking furious, and asked if he was sure. Changhai glanced at the laptop with a smirk and explained that, while the reward for completing a level 5 dungeon might be nothing in the eyes of adventurers, for more experienced level 6 to 10 adventurers who have a constant problem with running out of resources, this information is very valuable. He said that in adventurer circles, it was normal to use the services of such guys to search for information about dungeon, and adventurers from all the nearby provinces will rush to search for him. Who will avenge her brother? On the laptop screen, Lao Wang replied that he was willing to exchange TH. Sitting in the cinema hall is a level 7 adventurer, Gao Changyun, a wanted to rank criminal. He looks into an old push-button phone, which says that the sender has just received information about a novice adventurer who has passed a level 5 dungeon that no one has ever managed to pass before. The message declares a condition. Gao Changyun smiled crazily. Changhai is talking on the phone with a cup in his hand. He asks that his personal data will be entered into the official system within 3 days. Changhai smokes on the balcony and asks him if he's from Dongshan and offers to find him a temporary place to start so that Changhai doesn't have to wander around for a few days. Changhai refused, explaining that he would go to Dongshan on business and return here in a couple of days. The nurse looked at him worriedly, and the boy raised an eyebrow. Changhai smiled slightly with a cigarette in his hands and said that they would see each other in 3 days. He hung up the phone and looked off into the distance with a serious face, adding in his mind if he's still alive by then. The next day, Dongshan. Changhai stands in his house with a backpack in his hands, looking at the entrance to the dungeon, which has become noticeably wider. He said that he hadn't seen him for a few days and asked how he should feel about the dungeon entrance getting bigger. The main character walked up to the dungeon entrance and extended his hand towards it. A bolt of energy pushed his hand away. A red dialogue box appeared, stating that if his level is lower than 6th, then he can't enter the dungeon. Looking at the dialogue box, the main character said that it turns out that the dungeon is now only available for adventurers from the 6th to the 11th levels. He judged that he was currently at level 5, and according to his previous leveling speed, he would need to complete 1 to 2 more level 5 dungeons to advance to level 6. Changhai is sitting on the sofa, flipping on his phone. On the phone screen, it said, having adventurers from the association to help with the process. No vultures. Level 5 dungeon goblin crypt. We recruit thugs and interested private traders. Changhai typed out a question about what the recruitment conditions were. The person in the chat told him that he needed to have experience clearing level 5 dungeons, have a combat role or command title, and sign a temporary contract and after leaving the dungeon, according to the amount of the ko. Su-mao, wiping his sweat with a towel in the gym, asks over the phone why Changhai is asking him about black market gold coins. The main character replied with a smirk that he was looking through the forum and found that when adventurers on the forum trade with each other, they don't use cash, so he was curious about what gold coins they were talking about. Sitting down on a bench and taking out a bottle of water from his bag, Su-mao replied that, with the exception of low-level dungeon entrances and various drops, one of the most common currencies to pay for anything is black market gold coins. Changhai looked up thoughtfully, clutching his chin, and asked what was so special about them and why they couldn't just be paid in cash. Su-mao, holding the bottle to his lips, replied that gold coins were quite common in level 10 and higher dungeons, and that he had asked the trainer about it before. He said they were quite useful in high-level dungeons, but he didn't say what exactly. Changhai smiled and said that he understood and asked where adventurers whose level is lower than 10th get these coins, adding that he also needs a little. He replied that he could try to sell some of the drop items and asked if he had anything to sell. He added that he could take him to the local ghost market. The main character happily replied that there was, and thanked Su-mao. A city street with lots of signs, full of people. Su-mao and Changhai walked down the street. Su-mao says that the ghost market is open from 2 to 4 in the morning every Monday, and that there are a lot of people here, but the share of adventurers is 1/10, if not less. He explained that sellers here often sell fakes, taking advantage of the fact that those who are not adventurers can easily be deceived. They looked at the jargon and said that they were not adventurers, but they were like potions. Changhai smiled awkwardly and said that this place was a bit like an antique market. Su-mao chuckled and agreed. As he left, Su-mao raised his hand in a parting gesture and told the protagonist not to rush to sell everything at once, but to walk around and ask prices first, and then make deals. He explained that he had some business to attend to, so he wasn't going with him. Changhai agreed. He scratched the back of his head as he watched him go. With a slight smile, he said that he thought he wasn't a bad guy. Then, he decided that he needed to hurry up. He glanced at the man with earrings who was selling the loot from the kobold mine. Bones for 2 yuan, skulls for 5 yuan, and bone fragments for 1 yuan. Looking in the other direction, he saw a display of swords that read, "Top quality products, only today prices are reduced." A plump man was loudly announcing his wares, arms spread wide. Looking in the other direction again, he saw someone selling stones. Then he noticed a man in a cap sitting on a newspaper with a purchase sign in front of him. The man was wearing a gray jacket, gray pants and a blue cap, and had a beard on his face. His head was tilted down, making it impossible to see his face. On the paper in front of him was written, "Buy. Preference is given to items from low-level dungeons with female subjects that can attract their A." Changhai, reading the inscription, thought that according to the description, he intended to go to the banshee forest. The man asked if he had what he needed. Changhai thought about the fact that he had a banshee summoning harmonica and a special sword that was oiled. The main character folded his arms, replied that there was, and asked what price he was willing to pay. The man smiled broadly, raised his head to look at Changhai, reached out to adjust the visor of his cap, and asked for a look, and then he would tell him the price. Changhai turned around and indifferently said that he would go home to get the goods and come back in half an hour, and told him to wait for him here. The man replied that he should hurry up, because if he received other offers during this time, he would accept them. The main character replied that Changhai gave the man a harmonica and a sword. I look at the harmonica, and the man says it really can attract a banshee, and he's willing to give it to him. The main character smiled happily. The man stared thoughtfully at the sword. Changhai held up his index finger and smiled, explaining that this sword has a sacred attribute that gives plus to damage to evil creatures, and it is effective against the banshee's immunity to physical damage. The man said it was interesting. He offered to give him 8 gold coins for the sword and showed him the phone screen. The man told him to add him as a friend, so that in the future it would be easier to conduct transactions. Smiling broadly and looking at his phone, Changhai agreed. The payment confirmation came on the screen, and Changhai left, looking at the bag of coins with a smile. The man waved after him, wishing him luck with a smile. The man continues to stare after him, and then smiles ominously. This man was a level 7 adventurer, Gao Chengyan, a rank criminal. He said he forgot to take precautions, and the cemetery was cleared. Park, day. His wristwatch says 10 hours and 57 minutes, and the guy asks that it's been more than an hour, and the guy called Phil not home. Deciding that he wouldn't wait for him, The guy blue sweatshirt clapped his hands and greeted the audience, introducing himself as ZOZAI, the owner of the 5th level dungeon Goblin Crypt. He pointed to the left and said that on his left was Miss Lin, an adventurer from the association, and explained that she was mentioned on the official website. So they shouldn't worry about vultures. Lin was standing with her hand raised at face level, dressed in a business suit. She has black hair. A man in a black t-shirt, vest, and white forehead patch asked if she had been dipped in ink. ZOZAI pointed at the 3 men and said that it wasn't their first time joining him, and they were veterans with strong personalities. Behind the man in the blindfold was a man in a white sweater and a place. A plump man with graying hair and a well-groomed mustache, dressed in a gray suit with a red tie, waved with a big smile and greeted the audience. He introduced himself as Wang, the operator of Dongshan Real Estate. ZOZAI pointed at him and said that he was the sponsor of their operation, and that. Then he pointed at Changhai, who was smiling awkwardly, and said, and a girl in a pink sweatshirt that covered the lower part of her face with a collar, with black straight hair, who was looking at her phone without paying attention to what was happening around her. He introduced them as new friends. Still smiling, Changhai strained his eyes in exasperation, thinking about why dungeon owners like to meet in the park so much, and how it drives him crazy. ZOZAI ran to the car and called for them to follow him with his hand, saying that since they had been in the park for a long time, they had all familiarized themselves. They should follow him to the entrance of the Goblin Crypt dungeon. They followed him, and he said that the road was not close and offered to get water and something to eat. Gao Chengyun, who turned out to be the person with the nickname for Seas to Home, was looking out from behind a tree with a crazy smile, saying that he knew that Changhai only sold items but did not buy anything else and decided to use them to buy a ticket to a low-level dungeon. The car is coming down the road. Adventurers are walking through the forest. Wang asked ZOZAI, wiping away the sweat on his face, how far they still had to go. ZOZAI smiled, scratching his head, and replied that it wouldn't be long, and the entrance was right ahead. The blindfolded man asked ZOZAI how he found this entrance, noting that it was quite far away. ZOZAI replied that it wasn't found by him, but by a local fool who sold it to him. The man asked if there were any fools these days who would trade the entrance to a dungeon for money instead of clearing it out. Lin glanced at the man in the blindfold. Behind them are Changhai and the girl in the pink sweatshirt, who was looking at the main character. ZOZAI explained that since the crypt is really quite a difficult location for beginners, and the guy who discovered the entrance was the only survivor of those who tried to clear it, and since there, he said that part of the money from the deal was given to the families of his fallen comrades and suggested that this was reasonable. The man in the blindfold rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said that it was reasonable, but he didn't think that the guy really just sold him this dungeon. The men in the white sweater and blue jacket nodded their heads in silence. ZOZAI furiously turned to the blindfolded man and asked that he still doubted him even though it wasn't the first time they had cooperated. Lin noticed the green entrance to the dungeon and announced that they were here. She opened the book signed as a dungeon guide and looked at the entrance to the dungeon, saying that the shape, color, and size of this entrance completely matched the entrance to a level 5 forest or crypt. She closed the book. She told the adventurers that they could enter after they assessed the risks. The blindfolded man happily shook his fist in the air. ZOZAI said that he would personally vouch for the entrance to the dungeon. They started entering the dungeon one by one. ZOZAI stopped Changhai and the girl in the pink sweatshirt by blocking their path with his hand. Turning his head to them, he said that he had double-checked it and everything should be fine. He said that their father would protect Mr. Wang and asked if they had any objections, adding that the cheapness of the tickets for the two of them was due to him. Vaughn scratched the back of his head, smiling awkwardly as he patted his stomach, and said that he would share the meat with them. Changhai and the girl were silent for a moment. The girl asked what about the exit. She said that the main task is the same for everyone, but her mission is to escape. ZOZAI raised an eyebrow and smirked, saying that they would prioritize completing her mission and then deal with the rest. She said that then she would have no objections to entering the dungeon, and the reward from the main mission would be enough for her. The main character said that he has too. Changhai came out on the other side of the passageway in the forest, where the adventurers were already looking into their adventurer panels. The man with the blindfold asked the men in the jacket and sweater what their mission was, to which they replied that their mission was to kill 2 goblins. The man in the blindfold replied that it seems that everyone has the same type of task, the only difference is in the number. ZOZAI explained to Wang He pointed at the adventurers panel that the missions in this dungeon are given out based on the level. And in short, the main mission is to find the Goblin crypt. He explained that adventurers of 2-3 levels should discover it, and from -5 levels to K. Van replied that he understood, and added, looking at the girl in the pink sweatshirt, who gave him a questioning look in return, that it wasn't surprising that his missions were different from hers. Zozai clapped his hands and asked everyone to listen. He smilingly told them that since the newbies would be protecting Mr. Wong when they encounter the goblins, let them complete their missions first. Lin and the men from the blindfolded man's company agreed, and Zozai announced that they could move out. Changhai stared at the adventurers panel in surprise. The dialogue box says, "Challenge fight goblin warriors. Exit conditions, participate in killing goblin warriors." 2 hours later, the goblin's foot crushed the goblin from its mouth. A man in a blindfold pressing a goblin into a rock asked the protagonist if he wanted to. Changhai smiled awkwardly and declined. A man in a white sweater was sitting on a goblin, and a man in a jacket was smoking standing up. Van, wiping his sweat with a handkerchief, asked if these were the level 5 dungeon monsters, saying that they didn't seem all that strong. Lighting a cigarette in his mouth, the man in the blindfold explained that this was because these goblins were ordinary mobs, and the most difficult bosses were probably hidden in the depths of the crypt. He turned to him with a lit cigarette and said, I don't know. I usually take 3 to 5 veterans to defeat the boss in the crypt, and normal goblins aren't a problem for them, as long as their numbers don't exceed the limit." Van smiled, eyes wide, and said he understood. He said they could handle it if there were only a couple of goblins in the crypt. Zai replied that of course they could handle it, but as far as they knew, the number of goblin warriors didn't exceed 1 per crypt. Somewhere in the forest there's a cave, inside which it is dark. Zai said that there was only one known case of running into twin goblins, but he doubted it. Wong chuckled and said that he was calm then. Inside the cave, you can see a large goblin with huge fangs and gold earrings. This is a goblin warrior, challenge level 5. Behind him is an unknown figure with eyes glowing red, and the only thing known about this figure is that its challenge level is 5. A crowd of goblins armed with swords and clubs rushed to attack. A man in a blindfold, armed with a long-handled mace, which he holds in both hands, urged not to let the goblins escape. The man in the jacket was standing in a fighting stance, armed with brass knuckles. The man in the white sweater and the man in the jacket agreed and charged. Lin said it was bad, and Zai looked at her questioningly. He asked her what she was talking about. She replied that since they had entered the crypt, they had already encountered 4 waves of goblins, and they were all very simple warriors, but they had not gone deep inside, and there were abnormally many mobs in this dungeon. The men successfully fight the goblins attacking them. Lin said tensely that they might have hit the jackpot. The girl in the pink sweatshirt asked Wong, who was wiping his face with a handkerchief, why he was so desperate to become an adventurer when he had so much money. She said that if he didn't want to miss the opportunity to enter the dungeons, he could just become a sponsor for a couple of adventurers. Wong smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, saying that he was ashamed to admit, but mostly he wanted to become an adventurer to lose weight. The girl was shocked by this response. Raising an eyebrow, she asked what the connection was between losing weight and all these risks. Wang's eyes flashed and he clenched his fists in front of him, explaining that he had interviewed a couple of people he knew in the profession, and they all said that meditation practices didn't require any physical effort, but also helped you become stronger and leaner. He asked her if she didn't think that adventurer meditation training was the perfect weight loss option for those who had a lot of money and no time for exercise. The girl's face turned blue from shock and, looking away, she noted that he spends so much money just to lose weight and said that they, the rich, are really difficult to understand. Changhai appeared behind them and asked what they were talking about. He smiled awkwardly in his mail shirt and asked if he could go with them. Wang's eyes twinkled, and when he noticed that he was not able to go with them, he said that he really was a true professional. He gave a thumbs-up gesture of approval. The girl was surprised to ask the main character if he dressed up like this every time he went down to the dungeon. Stretching his arms, Oni replied that he would have just died in the dungeon last time without the chainmail, and he didn't understand why she wasn't wearing armor. She said nothing. The impact of the weapon drew blood from the goblin's wound on the ground. Wiping the sweat from his brow, the man in the blindfold announced that they were done. There were many goblin corpses in front of him. and he turned to Lin and Zio's eye and said that it was time to change, and the next wave of goblins would be upon them. Zio's eye smiled as he flexed his fists and said that it was their turn now. Changhai asked in shock about the scoring mechanism. The girl looked down at him and asked if he didn't know that the less power he used in the dungeon, the more points he would get for completing the task. He stared back intently, wondering if that was true. With a disappointed hand on her face, she said that it wasn't surprising that he didn't need to kill small mobs this time, since he was clearing a dungeon in full armor back then. She said that she was afraid that his ranks, equipment, and skills weren't enough, and considering that most of what he... Turning to him, she said that it was sad, and that she knew it wasn't worth expecting much, but she didn't expect it to be so bad. She concluded that they had not won, but to newcomers in need of protection. The man in the blindfold interrupted their conversation and said they would chat later. He beckoned to them with a wave of his hand and told them that the goblin squad that had blocked their path had been destroyed and they could move on. The main character was happy and went ahead. 10 minutes later, they were in front of 3 tunnels. Xiao Zai asked why there were 3 forks here, and shouldn't there be 2 in a 5th level bridge? Lin said that it seems that her previous fears were correct and they encountered a bug. She explained that this information about dungeons is not yet publicly available, and on average, in 1 out of 50 low-level dungeons, there is a moment when the actual difficulty exceeds or greatly exceeds the stated one. She explained that this is a bug. She said that there are 3 possible bugs. The first one is to increase the number of mobs, the second is to increase the number of bosses, the third is to increase the boss's strength. She held up 3 fingers and said that what they were facing was more like the first option. Changhai held his chin and raised an eyebrow thoughtfully, thinking that if her words were to be believed, then the problems he had encountered in the past dungeons. Vaughn anxiously asked Lin about the fact that if they went any further, they would run the risk of running into even more mobs. She replied that it was true. Vaughn held up his paw and said, and smiled awkwardly, noting that it was dangerous, and suggested that he forget about it and just go back, adding that he wanted to become an adventurer. Zishi shouted that he couldn't go back. Smiling and spreading his arms, he said that the number of mobs had exceeded everyone's expectations, but the boss's strength was probably still the same, and their task was not to kill all the goblins in the crypt. He said that they would just find the boss, kill them before the small goblins noticed them, and that it was no different from a normal mission. The man in the blindfold looked at him thoughtfully. Vaughn opened his mouth in surprise, and the girl raised an eyebrow. The girl frowned and said that the boss's strength hadn't changed, just in his imagination, and if he was wrong, it wouldn't be possible to deal with him quickly. She added that, if mob reinforcements arrived at this point, they would all die here. Zishi asked in displeasure if she was suggesting that we just give up and miss out on the opportunity to pass the dungeon. He told her that if she wasn't ready to take that risk, she should change her occupation and become a courier of some sort. The girl responded furiously, asking if the risk Washington. He asked if the reward for a bug dungeon was higher than for a normal one. She replied that it all depends on how much the actual complexity differs from the stated one. Lin said that it was rumored that even level 14 to 15 adventurers were sometimes willing to clear out such dungeons. To Zishi's eyes and the girl's bewilderment, a hand was raised and Changhai asked why not. Thinking awkwardly, he suggested that they just vote on whether to stay or come back. After a moment's thought, the man in the blindfold replied that it was a good idea and offered to vote. Zishi irritably shouted at the girl to leave, and no one was keeping her here. The girl was angry, raising his hand. Lin said to raise your hand to those who want to stay. The man in the blindfold, the man in the jacket, and the man in the sweater all raised their hands. Zishi raised his hand. Vaughn stood awkwardly still, not raising his hand. The girl waved her head, hands in her pocket, thinking that they were a team of fools without any risk assessment. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open and she glared furiously away, pointing her finger at the main character, who raised his hand with a ridiculous smile and shouted where he was going. She said those guys were at least level enough to fight, and she could understand them, but his strength was no good. So she asked him what he was up to. He said he wanted to try. Zishi smiled and told Wang that since everyone had made their choice, it was time to say goodbye, and said that he would return the money to Wang later. Wang shook his hand and declined, saying that he was happy to cooperate. The girl called out to Wang, who turned around in surprise. He ran after her, asking her to wait. The others turned to watch them go. A man with a bandage on his forehead and Zishi are looking inside one of the forks, wondering which way to go. A man with a bandage on his forehead says he thinks it's better to go to the right. Zishi smiled and flexed his wrist, offering to solve the problem with a game of rock, paper, scissors. They smirk as they bring their hand up behind them. Holding onto their wrists, the man asks what they will do if there is a draw. Zishi replies that then they will enter the passage in the middle. The man agreed. The man in the sweater was looking at them, smiling awkwardly, a plump man in a blouse. They started counting down. And the man threw a rock. And Zishi threw a paper. Zishi happily waved his hands up, and the man with a bandage on his forehead gritted his teeth and looked at his hand with 2 fingers outstretched, saying that he felt that it was worth throwing the scissors. Lin turned to the main character and told him not to climb when the boss appeared. She told him that his job was to get rid of mobs so that they wouldn't interfere with them. Changhai grinned, showing off his biceps, and agreed. A girl in a pink jacket and van are walking through the forest. Dan walks behind her. He called out to her awkwardly, his hand outstretched, and she turned questioningly. Vaughn asked why she didn't like them so much and if this dungeon was really that dangerous. The girl frowned and asked why he thought she didn't like them. Vaughn smiled as he scratched his head and said that he was a businessman, so he was a good judge of character. The girl pointed her finger at the redhead. Her title is a warning of danger. She said that she refused because of the title, and its effect is to tell the owner that danger is ahead. The girl explained that earlier in the crypt, she used it and found that there were 2 entities that pose a mortal. She remembers standing behind the others and seeing 2 bright red lights ahead. The girl said that when combined with the information that the association member had provided, it could be concluded that this dungeon was an incredibly rare and dangerous 2-boss dungeon. And that it should not be forgotten that it took 3 to 5 adventurers of the same level to complete a C. Wiping the sweat from his face with a handkerchief, Wong asked why she hadn't told them about this. Closing one eye and raising an eyebrow, the girl replied that if she told them, all the black information merchants would have information about her and her title tomorrow. Turning away, she asked why she had to sacrifice her own interests to keep them alive. She explained that, as their temporary teammate, she tried her best to convince them, and that it wasn't her fault that they decided not to listen to her. Wong smiled awkwardly and asked why she had told him about this. The girl replied that she wouldn't hurt him because he wasn't much of an adventurer and didn't need the money to turn her over to a merchant, and there was simply no one to tell him about her. Ban said he understood. She continued walking. But suddenly Wong noticed that she hadn't stopped walking. He asked her why she had stopped. The girl stared straight ahead with horror in her eyes. Looking at the green exit of the dungeon, she said that it was impossible to go any further because there were much worse dangers lurking outside. Gao Chengyin's sinister silhouette stands in the darkness, waiting for the adventurers on the other side of the portal. While wielding the tonfa, Ziozai blocks the goblin's sword strike above his head and stabs it in the stomach. Ziozai is surrounded by a small purple energy that looks like smoke. Lin holds out a glowing yellow hand with a glowing bracelet on its wrist towards Ziozai, who is fighting 6 goblins. She closed her eyes, concentrating. The man with the bandage on his forehead and the main character looked at her in surprise. Lin's eyes snapped open. A spiral of fire came out of her hand. She announced, "Second order magic practice fire stream." The torrents of flame burned the goblins, who were helplessly raising their hands in the air. Ziozai turned around in surprise. As he stared at his hands, surrounded by purple energy, he noticed that the elemental armor Lin had given him was just for this purpose. Gritting his teeth in surprise as he looked at Lin, the man with the patch on his forehead thought that as expected of an adventurer of the association. They were on the same level, but her skills, titles, and equipment were an order of magnitude higher, and her level of preparation for the task was. The burnt goblin falls to the ground. Ziozai stands untouched, surrounded by goblins lying on the ground. He gave Lin a thumbs up with a smile, complimenting her on her excellent work. Lin exhaled, wiping the sweat from her brow. She adjusted the bracelet and told the man in the blindfold and his team that the next wave of goblins was staying on them. They nervously and loudly agreed. A goblin with large gold rings in its ears smiled ominously. Changhai noticed the red dialogue box that appeared in front of him. It says that when an unregistered boss appears, the overall rating dungeon all increase. Zishi turned around when he saw the enemy approaching. In front of him was a goblin shaman. Test level 6, on his head was a large animal skull with horns, and he was leaning on a staff with skulls. Behind the goblin shaman were many goblin warriors. Zishi asked if it was the boss, noting that it was slightly different from normal goblins. Gritting his teeth tightly, The man with the patch on his forehead said that maybe not, because he was so small that he was lost in the background of ordinary goblins. Lin tensely opened her eyes wide and left them. They shouted that it wasn't a goblin warrior, but a goblin shaman, and that they should be careful. The adventurers looked at the goblin shaman with their weapons drawn. The goblin shaman grinned. He pointed his staff forward, and the goblin warriors charged. Lin pointed her finger forward tensely and told them to quickly deal with him before the other mobs showed up. She explained that if they didn't finish quickly, they would be in danger. The man wearing a band on his forehead with a gun in his hand and Changhai were both looking ahead intently. The two Lins left. There was a thud in the cave wall, and a crack appeared in it. The main character turned around in surprise. There's an explosion in the wall, and a huge goblin steps out, swinging his sword at Lin. Lin gritted her teeth in surprise, thinking about when the goblins started using battle strategy. She covered her face with her hands against the huge sword that was coming at her. Lin is crouched on the ground, shivering, his head in his hands in fright. She opened her eyes in surprise and saw Changhai blocking the huge goblin strike with a dark purple-bladed sword. His teeth are clenched tightly, and above his head is the title Vanquish Deed. The main character told her to run away, and that he was taking it upon himself. Zeuze and the man with a bandage on his forehead are fighting a crowd of goblin warriors, looking towards Lin and Changhai. Zeuze shouts that Lin is in trouble and needs help. The man angrily shouts at him that there are so many goblins here that they themselves need help. Changhai grits his teeth and barely holds the huge goblin sword with his own. Glancing at Lin, he shouted for her to help the others while he handled it himself. Turning to face him, Lin started to protest, but Changhai interrupted her, pushing the goblin sword away with a swing of his sword, and said that if she stayed here, she would only get in the way. Lin clenched her teeth, trembling. After a short silence, she ran to the others, shouting that she would quickly get rid of the shaman and help him. The huge goblin slammed its sword into the ground, causing a shockwave and leaving a crater in the ground. He grinned contentedly, but noticed that the main character wasn't in the scattered cloud of dust. Changhai calmly told him that no one would bother them now. He stood in the clearing cloud of dust, looking at the goblin. The main character pointed at the huge goblin with his sword and told it to attack with a calm face. Dance with Death. In a near-death state, the main character's damage is tripled. One step, one kill in a near-death state. The protagonist's perception increases to 18, and he will be able to predict. The veins on the goblin's face bulged with anger. He leapt at Changhai with a loud shout, swinging his sword over his head. Changhai slid on the ground between the goblin's legs, a swing of his sword hitting his leg. He skidded to a stop with his hand on the ground, turning sharply. The protagonist thought with a smirk that although this boss was very strong, it was too clumsy, and Changhai should be able to dodge most of his attacks even if they came one after another. The huge goblin looked at the cut on its leg, which was bleeding purple. He turned to the main character, his skin starting to turn red, his eyes glowing red in the shadows, and he was breathing heavily. Changhai looked at him in surprise, completely flushed. The goblin screamed in rage, the veins on its bald head bulging with anger, in a state of utter insanity. Pain T. The goblin charged towards the main character, swinging his sword. Changhai dodged a few of the goblin's attacks with light movements, thinking that it was too easy, and that even though the goblin's strength and speed had improved significantly, the goblin didn't have any special tactics, so it was easier to resist him. Calmly looking at the sword flying by the side of his face, the protagonist assumed that it was a standard level 5 dungeon boss. He looked ahead indifferently and found it a little annoying. Changhai knocked the weapon out of the goblin's hands with a slash of his sword, and it sank into the ground behind him. The goblin gripped his wrist, which was shaking from the impact. Then he looked in surprise at the main character, who was standing in front of him in a fighting stance, holding a sword in one hand. Changhai told him with a grim expression that with his level, he didn't even deserve a warm-up session. Looking at Changhai's purple sword, the goblin was startled and turned green. Turning green, he started running away in fear with a terrified expression on his face. Raising one eyebrow and rubbing his neck with his hand, Changhai noted that he didn't even have the courage to fight to the end. Looking after the goblin, who was running away through the hole in the wall from which he came, he decided to look at it from a different angle, and said that now he wouldn't make false expectations about level 5 dungeons. At the same time, Zaiuzai, a man with a bandage on his forehead and his companions are fighting a crowd of goblin warriors. Lin deflects purple projectiles from the goblin's hand. Brandishing his weapon, the man in the blindfold shouted tensely about how many goblins there were in this crypt and noted that they continued to advance and never ended. Xiao Zai turned to Lin and shouted for her to use fire magic. Lin, her brows drawn tight, shouted that she wanted to do it herself, but the goblin shaman was hindering her with his low-level spells. A goblin shaman with an evil smile waves his staff, creating purple spheres above his head. Xiao Zai turned around questioningly as a blue dialogue box appeared in front of him, announcing that the task was complete. Xiao Zai asked in surprise when he managed to complete the task. The man in the blindfold said that his tasks were also completed. Defending herself against the purple projectiles with a blue magic sphere around her, Lin said that Changhai seemed to have killed a huge goblin and said that he was about to join them. A man in a sweater with 2 swords and a man with brass knuckles are standing tenaciously in a fighting stance. Swinging his weapon, the man with the patch on his forehead killed another goblin and said that he had completed the task and he was not with them, adding that there was no point in risking himself for them. A man with brass knuckles shouted, suggesting that they just leave because their task was completed. Lin argued that if they didn't kill the shaman, their escape routes would be cut off by the goblins he controlled. Her hand glowed purple. Xiao Zai shouted with a tense face that Lin was right and they could leave now. He urged everyone to hold on. The man with 2 swords shouted, easy to say. Behind the grinning goblin shaman, there was a sound in the cave wall. Turning around, the shaman noticed that the wall had exploded. The man with the bandage on his forehead looked surprised. Changhai jumped out of the wall. Lin called out that it was him. The goblin shaman clenched his teeth tightly, and Xiao Zai opened his mouth in surprise. Changhai chopped off the goblin shaman's head with a single swing of his sword and was behind him. The goblin shaman's body and head lie on the ground behind the main character. The goblins looked on in horror and ran away in fear. Changhai wipes the purple blood from his sword. The blindfolded man asked in shock how he managed to handle everything on his own in an abnormal dungeon with 2 bosses. Xiao Zai rubbed his cheek awkwardly with his finger, shaking off the blood on his sword with a wave of his sword. Changhai began to speak. The adventurers looked at him in surprise. The main character smiled awkwardly, scratching his head, and asked them to keep his secret. Lin pointed out that this made sense because few people would want to miss out on an aspiring star like him, and he really should not show his nose until his level was high enough. Changhai raised his hand and smiled, thanking him for his understanding. He looked into the distance in surprise. A girl in a pink sweatshirt and van emerged from the darkness of the cave. A little earlier, the girl in the pink jacket, looking at the green exit from the dungeon, said that you cannot go out because there is a much deadlier danger outside. Wang asked excitedly. The girl with a frightened face said that there are adventurers who are worse in level and danger for her than the 2 bosses in this dungeon, and that if you go out, they will be finished. Lin asked what they should do. She offered to find the others to convince them to get out together. Van and the pink-shirted girl looked at the adventurers in surprise. The girl asked that they actually killed 2 bosses. The man in the jacket pointed with a smirk at Changhai, who was scratching his head with an awkward smile, and said that it could be said that Changhai had dealt with them himself without any help from them. She wondered how he did it, because she was testing him with her skill, and he wasn't a threat to her. Lin asked to wait and crossed her arms in front of her, asking how she knew there were 2 bosses in the dungeon. She asked if they were just standing there and watching them fight from the sidelines all this time. The girl pointed her finger at the red title above her head and said that it wasn't, and they got to the exit before they met the boss. She said that she learned about it because of her title, explaining that it helps her better recognize any dangers that threaten her, including evil creatures, and Zai pointed at her with a displeased face and asked why, since she had such a useful skill, she didn't warn them. Frowning, the girl said that she hadn't warned them, but strongly advised them not to continue on their way. Changhai asked her why she came back with a serious face. She replied that someone much stronger than these 2 was waiting for them at the exit, explaining that it was a high-level adventurer who was hostile, and he blocked the exit. The adventurers paused tensely, looking at her. Lin asked if she was sure that the door was blocked by high-level adventurers, and the girl replied positively. A man with a bandage on his forehead grabbed Zai by the collar and shouted in his face that the difficulty of the dungeon is higher than the standard, so the adventurer blocked the exit, and this time, too much suspicious, he asked if it was his business. Zaizai shouted back that it wasn't me, and if he didn't believe him, he suggested that he sign a special contract. Changhai tensely thought that perhaps the adventurer who was blocking the exit was the guy who never came. He thought that if that was the case, it might be possible, but it still didn't make sense. Changhai turned to the girl. Noting that her title is able to warn of danger, he asked if she could tell which of them was stronger if he expressed his intention to kill that person. The girl replied that she could. Changhai replied, "Fine." 3 red dialogue boxes and a dark purple energy appeared between the main character and the girl. The dialogue boxes say, the girl looked at him in surprise. Surrounded by a dark purple energy, Changhai with the title Death Runner asked which of them was stronger now. Everyone stared at him, their mouths hanging open in surprise. The girl replied tensely that the guy outside was a little stronger. Changhai calmly replied that he understood, and the purple energy around him began to dissipate. Thinking about it, Lin put her hand to her chin and looked down, saying that there was only one way out. She announced that they needed to complete their missions first, and when everyone was done, they would try to attack that adventurer together. The man with the bandage on his forehead gritted his teeth and agreed. Zaizai looked down with his eyes squeezed shut and his teeth clenched. He was shaking and said that if he had known that he would face so many problems after buying this dungeon, he wouldn't have gone for it. Turning around, Changhai calmly told him that it was useless to regret anything right now, and there were a lot of them, so they could handle it. On the other side of the portal, Gao Chengyun, a wanted-to-rank criminal, a level 7 adventurer, is standing in front of the dungeon entrance. Frowning in displeasure, he asked why no one had come out yet, adding that the guy who cleaned out the cemetery was definitely not going to die just like that. The girl in the pink sweatshirt is talking to Lin. Zaizai is talking to Wang. Zai is calmly looking at the dialogue box. He noted that he had received the report. In front of it was a dialogue box that said, "Calculation completed. Now you can once again challenge the Murloc dungeon where you almost died. Hurry up to get rid of the shame. New title received, Goblin Hunter. New title received, The Art of Darkness. Received a new title, Guardian. Exclusive skill." Looking at the report with a slight frown, Changhai noted that he didn't get any epic items this time, and that for some reason, the 2-boss dungeon was easier than the graveyard. He decided that it looked like there was nothing to waste on level 6 dungeons, and he could go straight to the next level. After opening his status screen, the main character opened a window with all his titles. +2, Speed +2, Constitution +2. It read, and with Murlocs 50 hectares, 50 automatic search for Murlocs with a level close to the host. So that the fight is fair. Deathwalker, if the wearer is seriously injured or near death and encounters an enemy whose strength exceeds his own. Stats increase, Strength +4, Agility +4, Perception. Changhai thought that out of all the titles, the only ones that would be useful to him were Wolf and Sheep's Clothing, Survivor of Legend, Art of Darkness, and Guardian. He noted that all their names are quite peculiar and that you need to think carefully and summarize all the additional indicators to the characteristics. He decided to first use the title Wolf and Sheep's Clothing to use it to get into the enemy's poor visibility zone and use the Art of Darkness, and then activate the professional skills Dance with Death and One Step One Kill to deliver the perfect blow. He thought about how he would then try to quickly switch between standing up against Legend and Guardian so that he would gain plus to Perception and pull off one move, one kill, with which he would be able to predict the opponent's next move. And as soon as he turned around to attack his comrade, H, and then his chance to stand up against an opponent who is stronger than him will increase significantly, and the main thing is to think through everything correctly and implement it. Thinking hard, the protagonist thought that he was confident in his titles and tactics, but making a choice in the direction of one is quite risky. Looking intently at the adventurer's panel, he said that it was necessary to examine the items he had received for all the time and then make a final decision. The dialogue box was confident in the main character's professional skills, Dance with Death, increased damage when the wearer is on the verge. Changhai opened his eyes wide with excitement and smiled nervously, saying that the skill Die to Survive is quite good and improves agility and speed. And with the skill One Step, One Kill it will be able to attack the enemy's voice. He noted that the fake death skill was also quite good, and it co. He imagined lying on the ground, pretending to be dead, while the other party sneaked up on him to steal, and then Changhai's smug face struck the other party with his sword. The main character thinks that if the adventurer who blocked the exit isn't crazy enough to fight the corpse, his plan will work. Changhai scratched his head and said that this was a last resort. Changhai said that he really had some good things this time, and that the bone flute, the shaman's banner, and the legacy book could definitely be useful to him in the future. He added that the potion could also be very useful, and with the flute, he could get a goblin as a companion. The main character said that given that that guy might be 2 or 3 levels stronger than him, he should save the rare item upgrade coupons as well as the smelting coupons. A helmet with long metal horns appeared in his hand, Claude's legendary undead helmet. Changhai recalled how the leader said that this item had the highest level among all the items that he had, and suggested that the best solution would be to use the coupons on it. The leader said that doesn't matter. The main character tensed up and gave the command to apply the coupon of a miracle item. The helmet in his hands glowed with a bright white light. The helmet remained in the hands of the main character, and a dialogue box with red text appeared in front of him, stating that this item has reached an epic level and the coupon cannot be used. Changhai noted that the epic level is the maximum. Putting the helmet on his head and flipping through the adventurer's panel, Changhai suggested that he should melt down what he didn't use and decide whether to use this coupon on what would come out after smelting. He selected a furnace in his inventory, and a dialogue box with several items appeared in front of him. He turned on the furnace with a button on the dialogue box, and another dialogue box appeared in front of him, stating that the arsonist's tools, Song of the Sea, and Rama are not equipment, and the number of times the furnace is used will not be used up. Frowning, the protagonist noted that such things cannot be melted down, and he will not be able to use spears and swords because it is difficult to melt them, and nothing useful can be obtained from them. Looking at the purple-bladed sword in his right hand, Changhai said that this sword also couldn't be upgraded anymore, even though it wasn't bad enough. The sword glowed with a white light and turned into a black knight's sword. When using this sword to kill an enemy that exceeds the wielder's strength, agility, and physical fitness are slightly improved. Looking at the sword, Changhai said with a smile that it was a good sword. Looking at his chainmail, the main character grinned and said that once he decided on a helmet and weapon, you can use coupons on armor, and this is a great opportunity to replace the chainmail that he bought online. The dialogue box announced that the exchange was successful and that the equipment upgrade coupon had been used. Changhai appeared to be wearing a large dark long armor. Looking at it, he said that this armor was lighter than the chainmail he used to wear. As Lin approached him, she asked if he was finished, and Zai Aoze looked at the protagonist in amazement. Changhai replied that he was almost done and asked if they were ready. Lin replied that they would be ready to move out soon. Zai Aoze was enthusiastically looking at the main character, shouting about how cool his equipment was and asking if he got it in this dungeon. Changhai opened the adventurer's panel and asked him to wait while he picked up a companion. Zai Aoze raised his palms in shock and asked them not to ignore him. A bone flute that looked more like a horn appeared in the protagonist's hand. Changhai raised it to his lips. He started blowing on it, and there was a loud sound. A small blue portal appeared in the wall, and a small goblin with long pointed ears and large round eyes emerged from it. The man with the patch on his forehead was disappointed to see that it was a goblin. He grabbed him by the head and lifted him off the ground, ignoring his protests. The man asked what use such a companion would be to him, adding that he had barely half a point of battle and was useless. Changhai turned to him with a smirk, holding the goblin potion in his hand, and said that he wasn't finished yet. He tossed the open potion into the goblin's hands, who held out his hands in surprise. The goblin sniffed the green potion intently. Changhai, holding the goblin shaman banner in his hand, told him to drink it. Goblin saw the main character as a goblin shaman and looked at him with an admiring glint in her eyes. The goblin obediently put his hand to his head and began to drink the potion. The man with the bandage on his forehead, still holding the goblin's head, looked at him with one eyebrow raised. Large blisters began to throb on the goblin's body. The man was horrified and threw the goblin to the ground in fright, asking what it had given him. The goblino's body was covered in swellings. He shouted loudly, reaching out his hand. Changhai was looking at him with a smirk. Lin and Xiaozai were staring open-mouthed in surprise. The goblin had grown huge and was looking at the changes in its body in surprise. Xiaozai asked about the fact that he had turned into a boss. The naked goblin danced happily as the main character stared at him in silence, dissatisfied with his nakedness. He called out to the goblin and pointed at the huge goblin boss lying on the ground with a grin, saying that his clothes and weapons were just right for him. The goblin obediently ran towards the body of the goblin boss. The man with the patch on his forehead asked fearfully, pointing a finger at the goblin to see if it would get out of control. Changhai replied indifferently that he didn't know. The main character with a smirk told the girl in the pink sweatshirt to use the title to check if he was hostile. The girl's eyes lit up red, and she looked at the goblin, who was rummaging through the things of the goblin lying on the ground. She said they didn't have to worry too much. The goblin snuggles happily against the huge sword. The man let out a sigh of relief. Lin, holding a hand to her face, prays to the goddess of magic to grant her divine power. Adventurers are standing in the forest. Lin holds out his palm and announces magic armor and bare endurance attribute. Purple energy radiates from her hand, directed towards the main character. Surrounded by purple energy, Changhai looked down at his hands and smiled as he noticed that his physical performance had improved. Wiping her face tiredly, Lin said that the buffs would only last for an hour and explained that magic armor could protect even parts that weren't covered by normal armor, and it couldn't compare to his armor, but it was better than nothing. She turned around questioningly. A goblin was standing in front of her, smiling enthusiastically and pointing his fingers at his face, asking her to apply effects on him as well. A contented goblin surrounded by red energy was showing off his biceps. The effect of Buffalo Power, Power Plus, was applied to it too. Lin lies exhausted on the ground, and a worried Xiaosei asks if she is okay. She replied that everything was fine, and she just needed some rest. The entrance to the dungeon lit up with green energy, and 3 silhouettes appeared in it. Gao Chengyun smiled as he noticed that they were finally coming out. He opened his eyes in surprise when he noticed that along with the adventurers, who were looking around intensely, there was a huge goblin. Gao Chengyun asked where it came from. Looking around, Xiaosei asked if it wasn't said that someone was blocking the exit and why no one was there. Turning to the girl in the pink sweatshirt, Changhai said that he probably managed it and asked her to check with the title. She agreed. The girl's eyes lit up red, and she said that he was hiding behind a tree. Gao Chengyun's silhouette could be seen behind the tree, and there were several traps on the ground in front of him. Oni shouted at them to be careful not to step on the traps they had set. The man in blazers asked himself, in surprise, what kind of traps she was talking about. Gao Chengyun clicked his tongue in frustration. As he came out from behind the tree, he asked them if they were still detectives. Adjusting the brim of his cap, he said, "What a pity." Changhai stared at him intently, recognizing him as a vendor from the market. He thought that it made sense because he had told him about the cleared banshee forest, and he immediately decided to try his luck in a dishonest way, probably knowing that Changhai was like that. Few people know where he is. Lin stared intently at Gao Chengyun. She recognized him as Gao Chengyun through his disguise. Pointing at him in surprise, she asked if he was Gao Chengyun. The others turned at the sound of her voice. Ben, wiping his face with a handkerchief, asked if she knew him. Lin gritted her teeth and said that he was the most wanted criminal in Fujian and Guangzhou. And even though he was only at the 7th level, the number of adventurers who had died at his hands was not in the tens, but in the hundreds, and it was rumored that the reason for his bloodshed was not just to get other people's things, but in his desire to have a special title. She imagines Gao Chengyun standing with his back to her, naked from the waist up, holding up his hand with a sinister smile. A lot of skeletal hands reach out to him. Lin said that it is believed that he was the one who gave birth to the title Bloodthirsty Killing of People and his real combat POW. Gao Chengyun said that she knew him well and asked if she was a guild member. Above his head, the red title Bloodthirsty Killing of Humans could be seen. His clothes changed to a shirt and a black jacket, the cap disappeared from his head, and his beard turned into a goatee on his chin, the black D. Gao Chengyun grinned ominously and offered to make a deal. Lin stared at him intently in silence. Gao Chengyun pointed his finger at Changhai and said that this guy was staying, and he was letting the others go. The man with the brass knuckles said that he would be fine and wanted to suggest leaving. Looking at Lin, who was standing in a fighting stance, holding onto her wrist, Lin yelled at them not to listen to Gao Chengyun, explaining that the guild records show that he liked to let his victims go for hunting. She asked how he could believe this nonsense and said that once he was done with the main character, he would hunt them down one by one, and there was nothing they. The girl in the pink sweatshirt agreed and said that even though he said that he would let them go, the level of anger did not decrease, which means that he is lying. Gao Chengyun's hand, that was scratching the back of his head, froze in mid-air. He asked her if she could check that out, too. The main character, standing next to the Goblin, said that everything is fine, and he is his goal, and even if he and the Goblin die, they will have to cope on their own. Changhai said that they were all in the same boat here, and urged them to have no illusions about him. Changhai glanced back with a threatening look, his gaze glowing red, and said that if any of them were afraid, he would ask them not to detain him. Lin confidently replied that they would help him. The man with the brass knuckles gritted his teeth in surprise. Gao Chengyun said with a smirk that they were good guys to die together. Changhai said they would beat him up. Gao Chengyun turned his attention to him with a smirk. He thought about how he knew that newbies who dropped an S-rank skill in the first couple of rounds would get too ambitious and consider all their opponents trash. He called up the adventurer panel and thought that this wasn't the case, and it was usually hard for level 1 to 5 adventurers to get a decent title, profession, and equipment. Weapons began to appear in Gao Chengyun's hand, and he told the protagonist that at first glance, his armor looked pretty good, and he probably had a lot of equipment in the Banshee Forest and Cemetery, but Gao Chengyun's skills were too good for him. A huge scythe appeared in his hands. The main character said that they would look at this again and rush to attack along with the Goblin, who spoke something in his own language. Gao Chengyun held out a palm that glowed white with a sinister grin. A white pulse shot out from her. Glancing at his hand, the protagonist noticed that it had slowed down. The Goblin behind him looked upset. Grinning smugly, Gao Chengyun swung the scythe at the protagonist and thought that he wasn't just slowing down, and that he was still a long way away from such a weapon. He thought about the fact that after slowing down, he wouldn't be able to adapt to everything happening and his attacks in a timmel. Changhai calmly noted that he understood what he was thinking. Gao Chengyun gritted his teeth in surprise. Changhai stands with the scythe blade in his hand, Claude's image visible behind him. Gao Chengyun gritted his teeth. The main character said that if this is all he has, then unfortunately, he will die today. Behind the surprised Gao Chengyun, a Goblin was swinging his sword at him. Gritting his teeth, he turned around and swore. Dropping his weapon, he jumped away from the Goblin's punch. Gao Chengyun thought about how he had blocked his combos so easily. Looking at Changhai, who was holding the scythe in his hand by the blade with an indifferent look, he wondered where such strength came from for a novice who had only completed 3 dungeons. Xiao Zai exultantly raised his fist in the air and said that he thought Changhai wasn't that strong. But he disarmed him in the blink of an eye and added that he felt that he didn't need their help. Lin tightly clenched her teeth and said that Changhai was too strong. Looking at the main character, who was standing with a scythe at the ready, surrounded by dark purple energy, Lin thought that he was probably on the same level as the newbies that the association had recruited, and even clearly stronger right now. Gao Chengyun, who was opening the adventurer panel, asked what if he said that he only wanted that geyser with the scythe from him. He stood wrapped in a purple cloak, a wicked smile on his face. This is an invisibility cloak that can make both a person and an inanimate object invisible. Changhai indifferently asked if he was serious. Grinning, he said yes. The protagonist noticed that Gao Chengyun had disappeared before his eyes, and opening his eyes wide and gritting his teeth in surprise, assumed that the cloak's effect was invisibility. The Goblin looked around, snarling, sword and scythe in hand. Gao Chengyun, as he approached the protagonist from behind, thought that he had met an incredibly strong rookie that he could compete with in strength, and he was even ashamed. A sword began to appear in his hand. He thought that even though he had never met such newcomers, he would not become a legend. Gao Chengyun thought with a serious face that the protagonist's journey would end here. A curved, bladed sword appeared in his hand, and he mentally asked him not to blame him, thinking that he was giving him a chance, but he chose to die. Gao Chengyun charged at the main character's back. A girl in a pink sweatshirt shouted to the main character to be careful, and he still left, but is nearby. Gao Chengyun glanced at her with gritted teeth, and the vein on his face bulged with anger. Turning around and swinging his sword, Changhai asked with a threatening expression where he was looking. It struck Gao Chengyun's torso, cutting it diagonally, and blood gushed out. Gao Chengyun thought about how impossible it was, gritting his teeth, his face twisted in pain. Falling to the ground, he asked how he knew where he was. Changhai began to walk slowly towards him, explaining that his perception was 20. And every move he made was assigned to him. Gao Chengyun was lying in a pool of blood, his face pale from the loss of blood, and his eyes started to roll up. Turning to the Goblin, The main character told him to kill him, to which the Goblin roared in the affirmative in response. As the Goblin approached Gao Chengyun, who was lying on the ground, he swung his scythe and blood spurted out. Gao Chengyun thought that fate wasn't fair. Taking off his helmet, the protagonist walked towards Lin, who was standing with her hands on her waist. The man with the brass knuckles stared at him, gritting his teeth in horror. Changhai walked over to Lin, smiling. He asked how long it would take to enter data if a person wants to become a member of the association. Lin replied with a slight grin that it was about half a day on weekdays. The main character thought that it seems that the reason why he will be persecuted is because someone leaked information that it was he who cleaned out the cemetery. Changhai held up his hand, smiled awkwardly with one eye closed, and said that the day before yesterday, she had verbally promised to take him to the association. But his details had still not been accepted. He asked if everything would be fine if he suddenly changed his place of residence. She stiffly replied that everything would be fine, and the association would always be happy to see him. Skyscraper. The phone on the desk rang. Changhai picked up the phone. Changhai on the other end of the call said that he thought about it and decided not to become an adventurer of Yunsao City. In front of him, an ambulance is loading a body on a stretcher into a car, and Lin is talking to a man in a suit. Changhai asked him why he had changed his mind if his informant. The protagonist replied that he had just gotten rid of a wanted criminal, and the Dongshin Association had invited him to join them. Changhai replied with a blank expression that becoming an adventurer in his hometown was indeed a good option. Changhai replied that he thought so too. Lin said goodbye and put the phone away from his ear. His face twisted with anger and he swore, smashing the phone on the table. Changhai turned his attention to Lin, who asked if he was finished. He smiled and said he was done. A girl in a pink sweatshirt approached them. The main character asked her why she hadn't left yet. She replied that she had also received an invitation from the Dongshin Association and added that she would buy information about Changhai on the black market later. Changhai smiled and then said that since she was invited, he suddenly wondered the Adventurers Association branch building. A man in a brown suit pointed his finger at a device with a large red button and asked the main character to turn off the title and professional skills and hit it with all his strength. Changhai smiled and agreed, taking a fighting stance. He swung his fist and punched with all his might. The device showed the number 12. Clenching his fist in the air, Changhai thought about how this was an official tool for testing the basic qualities of an adventurer, and how he had heard that the classes here were cool, so he wouldn't have to go to the gym. The goblin behind him was munching on popcorn, wondering what kind of power. Lin, a girl in a pink sweatshirt, entered the room and asked the bespectacled man wearing a white suit if they were done with the testing. The man replied that they were almost done and Changhai's strength and agility were 12. The goblin hit the machine and Changhai exclaimed enthusiastically that he had 17 points. Lin noticed that Changhai only had 12 points. She thought about how 12 points didn't match up with what he had shown in the dungeon back then, and thought he would have a 14 or 15 stat score. Even with this stat, he is equivalent to a level 9 adventurer, which means that his titles make up for the difference in stat points. The girl in the pink jacket, looking at the main character, who was arguing with the goblin, thought that the usual professions and titles were definitely not about him and assumed that he had some secret or combination. Lin called out to Changhai. She showed him the pass and said his details had been uploaded. Changhai looked at the pass in his hands and scratched his head, surprised that it was made so quickly. Lin replied that it was a special case because he had gone through the dungeon alone and defeated the boss. On the pass was a picture of Changhai, his name, Dongshin City, and phone number. Lin held up her index finger and said that adventurers of level 6 to 10 clear out similar dungeons about twice a year, after which they get the opportunity to go to a scouting group or a resource gathering team. Given that Changhai's basic stats could still be improved, Lin suggested that they take putting the pass around his neck. Changhai agreed. Lin added with a serious face that sometimes there are requests from the headquarters to join the team, and in this case, you can get a reward for finding criminals and monsters who accidentally entered this world. These rewards will be converted into contribution points, which can be used for title. Changhai listened to her with a calm face. He raised his hand and said he had a question. Lin replied that she was listening. The main character asked what the clues were. Lin replied that you can find out what is the probability of getting a new or repeated title, and the effectiveness of hints is proven by the association. She said that to access their information network, Changhai would need to use a pass, and there he would be able to find anything. The main character calmly looked at his pass. Holding up her palm, Lin explained that if he suddenly had items that he didn't need, he could sell them to the association or exchange them for contribution points or a certificate. Changhai replied that he understood. Lin held up her index finger and looked at the goblin with a nervous smile. Asking when he was going to fire his charge, the goblins scratched their heads in disbelief. Changhai asked if he could keep it and explained that the bone flute would summon a random goblin, and he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to summon it again, and he didn't want to lose such a charm. The goblin was actively nodding its head. Lin smiled awkwardly with her index finger raised and said that there was nothing to worry about, and if the goblin didn't die in this world, or if he didn't plan on summoning another goblin, he could always summon it again. The protagonist and the goblin smiled contentedly as they looked at each other. Level 6 Dungeon, Goblin Tribe. Little goblins play ball among the houses. Looking in front of him, he found a huge goblin coming out of a blue portal. They looked at each other in surprise. The portal next to Changhai and Lin closed. Lin walked forward and turned to the main character, calling him to follow her, saying that she would introduce him to her colleagues from Dongshan. Changhai agreed. A guy with short brown hair wearing a yellow sweatshirt with a star on the chest is a candidate for the Adventurer Association in Dongshan City. Liang Jiakan. He introduced himself, shouting awkwardly. The dark-skinned guy told him to remember to drop his sensitivity to the characteristics of adventurers, who were stronger than him when they first met, and added that it was ridiculous. His name is Chong Jingchuan, and he is a third-level adventurer, an adventurer of the Dongshan City Association. Liang Jiakan countered that his stats might be higher. The girl in the pink jacket thought that his characteristics were definitely not higher. Changhai turned to the guy with glasses and a white suit and asked if he was also from Dongshan. He calmly replied that he wasn't at full strength and that he was only at the 8th level, so he couldn't become the leader of the dungeon clearing. His name is Yao Wenzhong, a level 8 adventurer, an adventurer of the Dongshan City Association. The main character smiled and raised an eyebrow, asking if someone else was taking this position and if he came because he was currently in the dungeon. Yao Wenzhong replied that he didn't come because he was busy looking for a criminal adventurer. He said that it was rumored that he had come for the person who had cleaned out a graveyard dungeon in a nearby town. Changhai chuckled nervously. When Liang Jiakan heard about the graveyard, he exclaimed about how many weapon upgrade coupons were dropping, and that he was the only one who could do it. He shouted that it was cool, but not as cool as Changhai, who single-handedly cleared the dungeon and killed the boss, and that he was proud too. He was surprised to find that everyone was looking at him in silence. Blushing, he asked in displeasure why they were looking at him like that, and if he had said something wrong. Lin smiled maliciously and asked him what he still didn't understand. Liang Jiakan asked what it was and said that he was just sharing his thoughts. Chag Qingchuan turned tensely in the other direction. He said that he was surprised to find that everyone was looking at him in silence. Changhai stopped Liang Jiakan with a hand gesture and the latter looked at him with an awkward smile. The main character said that it was he who cleaned out that cemetery. Liang Jiakan shouted that Changhai was very cool. The main character is sitting in his apartment. While wearing armor and sitting on a chair, Changhai says that he really shouldn't be in a hurry, and it's better to spend time improving his physical fitness and raiding low-level dungeons. He took a serious look at the dungeon entrance in his house, and thought about the fact that this was the dungeon entrance he wanted to explore on his own. As he put the helmet on, he said that according to Lin, when he went all out, he reached level 10 in strength. As he entered the purple portal to the dungeon, he said that even if he couldn't clear the entire 7th level dungeon with such stats, he would still do something, and added that the most important thing was that there would be no surprises with the difficulty like last time. He came out in the woods. Looking around, he said that nothing seemed to have changed since last time. The main character noticed that a blue dialogue box appeared in front of him. It says that after the last promotion, he has access to elite dungeons. It also says, Title Induction, a system for switching between the main and additional professions and updating the taskbar. Looking at the dialogue box, he smiled and noticed that the panel could be refreshed. He said that according to the 4 stages of becoming an adventurer that he was told about earlier, the next upgrades were waiting for him at the 11th and 16th levels. 3 dialogue boxes appeared in front of the main character. In of them describes the induction of the title. An adventurer can use for main titles and 6 auxiliary titles during a dungeon raid. Titles can be switched at will during combat. To do this, open the panel that displays available title. Looking intently at the dialogue boxes, Changhai asked if there would be more restrictions as the level increased, and added that he was afraid to imagine what would happen after the 11th level. Continuing to press the buttons in the adventurer's panel, putting his hand on his belt, the main character was glad that there were 2 exit missions. He said that for adventurers who don't plan on completely clearing the dungeon, this is a great option. The dialogue box said, Title Induction. Main titles, I'm a 50 minutes 50 Murloc, a Death Runner, a Survivor, a Loner. Auxiliary titles, Wolf and Sheep's Claw, Clothing. Battle with Legend, Undead Slaying, Dark Art, Guardian. Passive titles, Undead Slayer, Goblin Hand. Changhai grinned with satisfaction. The dialogue box said, MURLOC Breeding Season, Challenge Level 7, Current Challenger 1 of 15, Normal Mission, Find the Murloc Spawn Point. Replacement Mission, Make Friends with the Gnoll. Task, Destroy the Murloc Spawn Point. There are 7 challenges left to complete the task in this dungeon. The main character noticed the mention of the Gnoll and, looking around fussily, will ask that, in addition to Murlocs, there are other monsters here. At the same time, in a level 6 dungeon, goblins go about their business among the thatched houses. The main character's goblin is roasting meat on a bonfire, and the little goblins around him are looking at the meat with an appetite. Suddenly, they notice something and growled in surprise. A blue portal appeared behind the main character's goblin, who was looking at them in disbelief. The goblins were surprised to find that it had disappeared, along with the portal. They clutched their heads in frustration as their meat disappeared along with the big goblin. Changhai eats the meat that the goblin was roasting. He clarifies that the dwarf tells him that the gnolls are devious and cunning, and they are real bullies. The goblin is busy gesturing to him. Changhai clarified to him that they were something like forest robbers. The goblin smiled and gave him an approving thumbs up. The main character looked down in front of him and thought that before completing the task with the gnolls, he needed to find a spawn point to try out the task, and if it didn't work out, he would try again next time. Changhai told the goblin that that was all and he could go back. The man opened his mouth in surprise. Raising an eyebrow, Changhai asked him what he didn't want. The goblin nodded with a pitiful expression. Clearing his throat slightly, Changhai said that he could go with him. The goblin happily clenched his fist in front of him and made a satisfied sound while smiling. They walked down the road and Changhai, meat in hand, told him that the difficult task was over. The goblin said of this dungeon was slightly higher than level 7 and he needed to be calmer. The goblin growled affirmatively, showing off his biceps. Someone steps behind them. An anthropomorphic creature with the head of a wolf and gnoll scout looked after them with a spear in his hand and noted that it was a man and a goblin. He assumed they were adventurers. Wang and Caohua Wang, a rich man from Fujian province, lie on their stomachs on massage tables while masseuses give them massages. Caohua Wang asked Wang if it was true that he had assembled a team to guide him through the dungeons, praising him for his bravery. Smiling, Wang said that there really wasn't anything terrible, except for one incident. He added that on the other hand, he had met 2 adventurers with great potential. Caohua Wang replied with a serious face that if there were reliable adventurers, his son wouldn't have died. Opening one eye, Vaughn replied that he knew, and so he chose those who would go with him carefully. Otherwise he wouldn't even be venturing into the 2nd level dungeon. He added that he did not want the adventurer he had hired to abandon him to certain destruction at a dangerous moment. I remembered, he said, that the news reported that past few days said that the death of Caohua Wang's son was not accidental at all, and asked if it was true. The man with a serious face asked what kind of accident he might be talking about. He explained that before his son went to the dungeon, he prepared 2 items for him that would ensure his survival even in an elite dungeon, but he is dead and the dungeon owners are still alive. Caohua Wang added that he was sorry that those 2 were killed before he got to them, otherwise he would definitely make them regret being born into this world. Wang said with a worried face that he needed to thank the person who had indirectly avenged his son. He asked me his name. Caohua Wang replied that his name was Changhai, and he had come here to personally thank his hearing the main character's name. Wang was surprised. Seeing his reaction, Caohua Wang asked if they knew each other. Wang smiled awkwardly and said that there was a person with that name on his team, and it might be him. Caohua Wang opened his mouth in surprise. 4 murlocs are walking along the road in the forest. Challenge level 3. A murloc with yellow spikes on its back told everyone to get ready in its own language and said that no one would be able to save him. The murlocs with fins on their backs agreed. The eyes of Changhai and the Goblin appeared in the bushes. With loud shouts, they leapt out of the bushes at the nearest murloc, brandishing their weapons. Noticing this, the murlocs turned around. After a small fight, the 4 murlocs were tied up. Changhai asked the Goblin, who was standing with his hands folded in front of him, if he spoke the murloc language. He answered in his own language that he was speaking and asked if he needed help translating. Changhai replied, "Not now," opening the inventory on the adventurer panel. He said with a grim grin that he had one thing that would help him with this. He added that, if it didn't work out, he would ask the Goblin for help. In his hands was a seashell, the song of the sea, with which he can breathe underwater and communicate with aquatic creatures. He crouched down in front of the disgruntled murlocs. Changhai held up his index finger and asked me to tell him where their spawn point was. He was interrupted by a stream of liquid pouring into his face. The enraged murloc cursed and asked in his own language if he thought he would betray his clan. He shouted at them to just kill them. Changhai wipes his face with his sword hand, and the Goblin clutches his head in horror. Between Changhai's fingers, his furious gaze could be seen. A yellow-spiked murloc lay on the ground, cut in half. The other murlocs were horrified to see that their captain was dead. One of the murlocs shouted that he would avenge his captain, and the other two looked at him in surprise. Soon, this murloc was also on the ground, cut in half. One of the murlocs, terrified, said that there was a cave at the bottom of the lake, where their spawn point was located. The other murloc on his right glared at him and shouted that he was a traitor. With a swing of his sword, the main character chopped off the right murloc's head, and the remaining murloc looked on in horror. Turning to the Goblin, who was looking at the scene with a worried face, he said that they would leave this murloc for now and hang it on a tree. Changhai shouted at the Goblin, asking why he was standing up there. The Goblin was trembling in fear, hiding behind a tree and looking at the main character. Upset to the point of tears, the murloc ended up hanging upside down from a tree with a rope. Changhai announced that they could go, and the Goblin growled his agreement. 2 gnoll silhouettes appeared behind the murloc, startling him. One of them said that this adventurer is quite strong. The murloc turned around and exclaimed that they were gnoll warriors. In front of him was a gnoll scout with a spear and yellow eyes. Test level 3. Standing next to him was a gnoll warrior named Hog. Challenge level 8. He was considerably larger than the scout, armored and scarred, and had 2 axes on his back. Turning to the gnoll scout, the gnoll warrior told him to tell the others to lure the murlocs out of the lake to help the adventurer destroy their spawn point. The gnoll scout agreed. Then, to the murloc's horror, the gnoll warrior turned to face him, axe in hand. He cut off the murloc's head. The main character and the Goblin were near the lake. Changhai was surprised to see that the lake was bigger than he thought. Scratching his head, he said that first they needed to find an underwater cave and then enter it. He said he didn't know how long it would take them to sail, but he needed to find this place. Changhai guessed that this was where 99% of the adventurers were eliminated. He thought about how it seemed. He pictured an adventurer and a gnoll, smiling awkwardly as they agreed on something while passing a bag to each other. Changhai noted that the 7th level dungeon, as expected, was different from the 5th level Goblin crypt. Looking at the shell with a smile, the main character said that he has the Song of the Sea, which allows him to breathe underwater. He noted that he wasn't a very good swimmer, but Claude's helmet-based combat experience also includes underwater combat skills, and he thinks that makes up for his lack. The Goblin growled something, and Changhai turned to him questioningly, smiling awkwardly and rubbing his bald head. The Goblin said that he couldn't swim and asked if it was okay for him not to walk. Changhai asked in disappointment that he couldn't swim. Grinning awkwardly as he opened the adventurer's panel, the protagonist told him to go back first. The blue portal in front of the main character disappeared along with the Goblin. He looked out at the lake in silence. He said that his body is not very suitable for diving, and it is better for him to remove everything except the helmet. Changhai stretches his legs, wearing only a helmet and underpants. He straightened up, flexing his shoulders, and said that he was done with the warm-up routine. He pushed off from the ground and dived into the water with a smile. While swimming underwater, he noted that thanks to the helmet and the Song of the Sea, even he can feel comfortable in the water. Under the main character, something with a large fin moved at the bottom. Hidden in the sand was a murloc. Challenge level 4. Its eyes glowed yellow, and it had huge sharp teeth. Changhai swims through an underwater cave. He noticed something, and found that the surface of the water was in front of him. He floated up and looked around. He found himself in a cave filled with murloc eggs. 2 small murlocs with big eyes stretched out of their eggs. These are murlocs toddlers, challenge level 1. Changhai noticed that a blue dialogue box appeared in front of him. It said that the escape quest to find the murloc spawn point had been completed. The main character noted that the mission was completed, which means that he is in the right place. He glanced at the eggs and wondered why there were no guards. He thought that they thought this place was well hidden, so they didn't put a guard on it, or that there is a guard, but now for some reason it is missing. He paused tensely. Changhai then walked out of the water, deciding that this wasn't the time to think about it. Standing in front of the murloc eggs, he said that he had a great chance and couldn't let it go. A sword appeared in his hand. From above, the murlocs clung to the stalactites on the cave ceiling and stared down at the main character. Changhai looked around cautiously, and there were more murlocs hanging from the ceiling behind him. They jumped to the ground behind him. Changhai turned around in surprise. Blue murlocs with red appendages on their backs, armed with swords and spears, noted that he was only one. One of them smiled and said that after all this time, there are still fools who are trying to get here. These are nest keepers, challenge level 6. Another murloc keeper with a scarred eye replied that he did not expect a human to be able to get in. Grabbing the sword with both hands, Changhai noticed that the guards were just hiding behind him. He thought hard about the fact that he wouldn't have time to put on his equipment and decided to use one of the abilities. At the same time, several black murlocs surfaced on the surface of the lake. They puffed out their cheeks and then shouted loudly, causing the sound to reverberate throughout the forest. A yellow murloc with red corals on its shoulders noticed the sound. A gnoll lay dead beside him, and behind it another murloc was fighting another gnoll. This is the murloc leader, challenge level 7. He tensed and realized that a human had barged in. The gnoll warrior swung his axe, and the murloc keeper hit the big red murloc with it. He opened one eye questioningly. The gnolls noticed that the murlocs were leaving. The gnoll scout, holding his shoulder, told the gnoll warrior that the murlocs had retreated and their sentries had spotted the man. He told me to send someone smart to the lake, and if the adventurer escaped, let him know. The gnoll scout agreed. The dialogue box says, Black Knight Sword effect activated when fighting an enemy. Build +1. Wiping sweat from his brow, Changhai stands among the murloc guardians lying on the ground and says that the strength of these guards is much greater than that of ordinary murlocs and that they must be the bosses of this dungeon. Behind him, red appendages appear out of the water. The main character turns around questioningly, and the leader of the murlocs and several red elite murlocs come out of the ground. Murloc Boss Boost increases the level and overall strength of murloc squads by 1 level. The headquarters building, one of the best on the assignations list. The person at the board explains that bosses in level 6 to 10 dungeons can be divided into several categories. In the audience, only Bujaming, Contract Adventurer, Adventurer level 8, Title, Flames and Explosions, and Quanchong, Contract Adventurer, Adventurer level 8, Title, Fist Fighter, are seated. Bujaming has light gray hair and wears glasses. Quanchong is wearing a yellow sweatshirt and has red H. Quanchong begins to stretch loudly, and the veins on the face of the man at the blackboard bulge with anger, and he smiles. Angrily turning around and throwing a marker in his direction, the man shouted that they either miss his classes every time or sit and yawn. He asked if his lectures were that boring. Quanchong caught the marker in his hand and squeezed it, breaking it. He replied that he was just repeating the same thing, and he would listen as soon as he started lecturing about level 11 dungeons. The man leaned to hands on the table and asked if they thought he enjoyed these lectures. He furiously shouted that it wasn't his fault that adventurers weren't able to pass dungeons that far exceeded their level, and asked about how they didn't want to die the first time they met a boss like their acquaintance. He added that he himself does not like to lecture such blockheads. Quanchong opened his mouth in surprise and asked again about the fact that someone had died. Bujaming calmly said that everyone on the forums was just talking about it, and added that after his death, a series of changes had started in their circles or something. Quanchong grinned and turned to him, saying that he really didn't know, and asked him to tell him more about it. An elite red murloc leapt at the man, and the latter cut him in half with a sword strike. The Murloc leader stands on the sidelines while Changhai fights a crowd of elite red Murlocs. The leader of the Murlocs shouted in their own language to watch out for the newcomer because he is a rare shot and stealth attacks don't work on him. He explained that they needed to attack him all together because he wouldn't be able to fight back from all four sides. The Murlocs agreed, covered in wounds all over his body. Changhai glanced at the Murloc leader, gritted his teeth, and asked what was wrong with him because he had killed so many of his fighters, and the Murloc leader was just watching from the sidelines. He guessed that even such strong warriors. The dialogue box says, the effect of destroying an enemy with a sword has reached the limit, +2 to dexterity and +3 to constitution. The Murloc leader shouted for them to work harder and exhaust the main character until he was completely exhausted. The elite Murlocs, leaping at Changhai from all directions, agreed. The Murloc leader thought with an evil grin that they were roughly equal in strength and was glad that he had come here alone and that ordinary fighters could handle him. He thought that the main character's killing speed was amazing, but when he was exhausted, his warriors would be able to kill H. He pictured silhouettes of gnolls with weapons in their hands and wondered what would happen when they noticed that there were fewer of them. Stepping forward, he said it wasn't important, and they should take the risk. Changhai noticed the Murloc leader approaching, armed with a sword. He asked him with a smile if he had finally decided to participate. Over the head of the main character, the title miraculously survived. Changhai rushed towards the Murloc leader, shouting that he had been waiting for this moment and calling the adventurer Pain. The elite Murlocs watched him go. They shouted to their leader, warning him that Changhai was very strong and he needed to be careful. The Murloc leader swung his sword and said that he knew. Pushing off from the ground, the protagonist leapt forward, swinging his sword in front of him. A small gash appeared on the Murloc's arm, and purple blood gushed out. A large diagonal wound appeared along Changhai's torso, and blood gushed out, and he gritted his teeth, grinning. He thought that the last line of defense had been breached. He was leaning on the ground, bleeding profusely, wearing an invisibility cloak, and holding a red potion between his teeth. Changhai dived under the water, and one of the elite Murlocs called out to their leader. He shouted back at them to leave him alone, and that he was sure Changhai's injuries were much more serious. He said he paid for his chance of escape with a serious injury that would make him weaker and less mobile. He asked them that they would be able to catch up with him without his help, kill Hai. The Murlocs said they could. Elite Murlocs swim along an underground cave and see blood in the water in front of them. They are surprised to see that this blood is coming from the body of a black Murloc that has been cut in half. The elite Murloc exclaimed in surprise, asking if that guy was seriously injured and how he managed to escape after dealing with their sentries. Another Murloc, looking at the body, said that he killed them with a single blow and noted that he was quite good at underwater combat. He said that there were signs that their boss might have been mistaken, and it was likely that Changhai's injuries weren't that serious. Another elite Murloc exclaimed in surprise. Changhai came out of the water by the lake. Gritting his teeth, he said that he was still alive because of the title, and that he did not think that without it, he would have been able to maintain his swimming speed and combat capability. The title of Miracle Survivor gives +5 to the Constitution when the life of the owner is on the ver. A Null Scout looks out from the bushes at the main character. He notices the wound on Changhai's stomach. The Null Warrior asks if he made it out alive, and how he did it. The Null Scout dropped to one knee and replied that he couldn't get close enough to see everything, but that he was very much injured. Grinning, the Null Warrior asked about the fact that he was seriously injured. Changhai's body was glowing, and there wasn't a single wound on it. The elite Murlocs that were peeking out of the water suddenly dived under the water when they found that the latter had noticed them. With an exasperated but cool face, Changhai said that he would get even with them next time. A Goblin came out of the blue portal. While Changhai was putting on his armor, the Goblin growled, asking if it was over. Opening one eye slightly, the main character replied that there were too many Murlocs, and he could not cope with them alone. He said that he had flipped through his legacy book and found a new one. He said that he had found a new goblins, accumulated a certain number of battles, and raised their leave. He handed the Goblin his sword and told him that it was now his own, and that in the future he would try to find dungeons with monsters that matched his level. He added that the latter had returned the sword to him when he had leveled up. The Goblin asked worriedly what Changhai would use. He grinned, and a large scythe appeared in his hand. He said he would use it. He said with a smile that they needed to practice snorkeling, and that they would need it when he decided to come back here. The Goblin agreed sadly. Hanging from the tree was the headless corpse of a lock tied by its legs to a tree. The goblin said in surprise that it was most likely done by the gnolls. Changhai paused thoughtfully. Turning to the side, he said, "Activate Dance with Death." The blue dialogue box says adventurer takes the lead and enters a life-threatening state by activating the title plus for perception. A gnoll axe can be seen in the bush next to the murloc corpse. The goblin is sitting on the ground and Changhai is standing with a scythe on his shoulder. A gnoll warrior stares at them from the bushes, axe in hand. Noticing the enemy's approach, Changhai opens his eyes in surprise and turns around, asking who is there. In front of him, a gnoll warrior leapt at him, tongue hanging out, 2 axes in hand. The main character looked at him in surprise. Gritting his teeth, he blocked the gnoll warrior's blow with the hilt of his scythe. The gnoll chuckled and jumped back. The goblin exclaimed when he saw the gnoll. Changhai gritted his teeth in fright and was glad in his mind that he had raised his perception to 20. Otherwise, he would have been dead already. The gnoll warrior stared intently at the protagonist, wondering if he was seriously injured, and thinking that the wounded man couldn't pull off what he did, decided that it was another guy. The gnoll grinned silently and jumped into the bushes. The goblin shouted that he was running away. Changhai said with a serious face that it wasn't accurate, and perhaps he was trying to trap Sutham in this way. The goblin turned to Changhai, pointing his finger at the bushes, and asked if they would follow him. The main character imagined a situation in which they find themselves surrounded by gnolls. He says that they will not pursue him, and that they will come back and settle scores with him when they find a strong teammate. Changhai returned to his home through the purple portal. As he took off his helmet, he said that he didn't think level 6 to 10 dungeons would be so much harder than level 5 dungeons. Looking seriously ahead, he said that it wasn't surprising that from level 6, adventurers were divided into a scouting group and a strategy group because without enough information, the dungeon was simply impossible to pass. He noticed that a blue dialogue box appeared, stating that the task of finding a murloc spawn site had been found and the task of making friends with a gnoll had failed. Changhai noticed that the mission was not complete, and he said that he would have to go to the dungeon to find the murloc spawn. It says that they all know perfectly well that for him, the fact that he managed to get out of the dungeon is a real miracle. His reward is wood and 1 bag of animal feed. After being silent for a while, Changhai shouted angrily, asking how they knew about the allergy. He shouted that he was a human and didn't need animal feed. He decided to try it and soon spat it out, saying that it was disgusting. Changhai's house. Zhu Cheng asks why the association gave such an order, and why Changhai then even assured her that Changhai was dead. Changhai goes up the stairs. Turning around, he replied angrily, asking what he could do if Gao Cheng Yun fell into his hands. Zhu Cheng angrily shouted that he didn't seem to care much about it. She reminded him that her grandfather was responsible for getting his job, and asked if he was worried about getting fired. Changhai pursed his lips. Taking out a red phone, she said that she had underestimated him, and that if she had known earlier, she would not have given up the resources that her grandfather left behind. Changhai asked her what she was doing while she was making a phone call. She asked him irritably that he didn't need them, and said that if he didn't do something, he would give them to a stranger who would help her get revenge. A girl in a pink cap and headphones is sitting at a computer, sipping a drink through a straw. Suddenly, her eyes widened in surprise. A quest has appeared on the forum. Kill level 6 adventurer Changhai in Dongshan. The performer will receive an epic resource from legendary adventurer Zhu Zhanming. Overnight, Jim. Ko-chan counts while doing push-ups on his fingers while a red-haired girl sits on top of him, looking at her phone. When he counted to 363, the girl said that there was something on the black market that he might be interested in. While doing one-handed push-ups, he told her to talk, flipping through the forum. She said that someone was offering a relic of a legendary adventurer as a reward for a mission. Coach and paused for a moment. Turning around, he asked who Zhu Mao had offended again. The girl replied with a smile that it wasn't Zhu Mao, but it was also an acquaintance of theirs. The phone rang. A sleepy Changhai picks up the phone, wiping his eyes with his hand. The nurse shouts at him worriedly that he has become a target. Yawning, the protagonist asked if he had told her about it, and said that he had already settled everything. He shouted that this time was different, and someone offered a high price for his life on the black market. Changhai's eyes opened wide in surprise. The nurse said it was really serious, and the price was exorbitant. She added that even her brother said that if he hadn't saved her then, he would have. Leaning on his knees, he asked me to tell him exactly what had happened. A forum post says, kill a level 6 adventurer Changhai in Dongshan. The performer will receive an epic resource from legendary adventurer Ju Jianming. Whole information. Passed the 4th level dungeon Banshee Forest and the 5th level dungeon Graveyard. Got rid of the rank criminal who was killing Oath. Changhai looks at the monitor screen from behind Lin, who is sitting at the computer. She exclaimed in surprise that the reward was really something. Changhai nervously asked if it was possible to find out who posted this. Touching her chin thoughtfully, she said that there was no need, and judging from the reward offered, it was definitely a direct relative of Ju Jianming. She turned to him and asked him how he had managed to become an enemy of such a person, adding that he was almost willing to sacrifice the resources of a true legend for him. Changhai replied that he did not know and had never heard of anyone like this. His soul began to leave his body. Taking out her phone, Lin said that she would contact her boss and try to do something about it, adding that they might be able to fix this misunderstanding somehow. The main character replied that he would be grateful. Lin said that he wasn't leaving the association for the next few days because she was sure that a lot of people were interested in the award. The window in the main character's house is broken. A man looks at the muddy footprints on the floor and realizes that someone beat him to it. Looking around, he notes that there was no fight and that Changhai was exploring the dungeon that is right at his house. This is Wang A level 10 adventurer whose main profession is assassin and his second specialty is thief. Wang A has black eyes and blonde hair. Wang A said that he didn't know if it was luck or not, but at least he managed to avoid the first wave. When entering the portal, Wang A says that if the dialogue box says, Title Murloc Breeding Season, Test Level 7, Current Applicants, 6 out of 15, Main Tasks. Find a Murloc spawn location, Additional Tasks, Make friends with a Knoll Passing, Destroy the Murloc Incubator, Remaining number of attempts, 8. After completion, the number of attempts is. Looking thoughtfully at the dialogue box, Wang A says that if he is blocked, Wang A notes that there are several other people here besides him, and that he doesn't know how many of them are this guy's companions and how many are the hunters who are chasing him. The armored man is lying on the ground, gritting his teeth in pain, cursing the opponent. A Knoll warrior covered in wounds pulls an axe out of a man's body, spraying his blood, and says that he, a human, can't beat him. A Knoll warrior stands surrounded by the dead bodies of other Knolls. Turning to the Knolls, who were helping each other walk, he asked where this adventurer came from because he had ordered the entrance to be guarded. He added that he had been to the entrance of the entrance to the entrance to the entrance of the entrance of the entrance. He added that he was badly wounded, not to mention his soldiers. He thought about what would happen if Changhai returned or led the Murlocs, and then he thought that they couldn't allow such nonsense. He decided to leave. Wang A stands on the bank and looks around. He sees a man in a red t-shirt with a huge sword on one side, and two men on the other. Thinking about it, Wang estimated that there were 3 hunters, which meant that the target didn't have more than one companion. Then he thought about how he needed to look at it from a different angle, and the hardest part of this quest wasn't finding and killing the target. Ju Mao knocked on the open door and asked Kakin if he was looking for him. Kakin, while exercising with dumbbells, asked him if he knew that there was a bounty on Changhai's head. He paused for a moment, then said that he knew. Kakin, with a serious face, told him to call him because he might not know about it. He told him to invite him to go with him to any level 6 to 10 dungeon. He asked if he needed to be told what to do next. Changhai stares intently at the ringing phone. Ju Mao's name flashed on the screen, and the protagonist noted that Ju Mao was calling him. As he stared intently at the phone, he wondered if it was meant to warn him or to see if he knew there was a bounty on his head. Covering his ears with his hands, Changhai decides that he will not answer and says that in any case, he has an entrance to the dungeon at home, and if anything, he will say that he was there. In the Changhai house, a man and a woman with light brown hair, wearing sunglasses and a coat, are standing in front of the dungeon portal. The woman points out that they are already late, and Changhai must have already been chased into the dungeon by others. She asked if they'd come in anyway. The man, touching the floor with his hand, replied that they would come in. Once inside the dungeon, they opened the adventurer's panels. Tasks appeared in the blue dialogue box. Wang A wonders why the tasks have changed. He assumed that so many Knolls had been slaughtered that they were no longer enough for a standard mission. A guy with gray hair slicked back walked up to him and greeted him. He asked if Wang A would like to join them, adding that he thought they had something to discuss with him. He glanced at the man in the red vest with the huge sword and the man with the huge shield on his back. Wanga glanced at them indifferently, but walked over to them. Wanga asks in surprise about the fact that they were the first to enter this dungeon, and Changhai isn't here. The man in the red vest replied that he was the first, and the others came after him. Wanga glanced at the man with the shield on his back. Turning back to the man in the red vest, he asked why they couldn't get out if there was no one blocking the exit, since all the adventurers were here by the lake. The man in the red vest replied that since his companion's ability is related to marine life, he found out that an outstanding sea beast. Wanga asked why they couldn't just do it and leave. The man with the shield replied that it was because after using the drone to search for Changhai, they found traces of him. The man with the white hair said that later they were convinced that he had been in the lake, but they don't know when or why he left, or if he left at all, so they are standing here. The man in the red vest shouted that they couldn't blame him for this, and it wasn't his fault that his companion had such a gift. Jay said he couldn't swim, and asked what else he could do besides wait for him to return. The man with the shield and the man with the white hair started cursing at him in exasperation, and he got angry in response. Wanga stopped them and waved his hand in front of him, saying that he understood everything, and asked what was there to discuss. The man in the red vest looked down, pausing for a moment. He then said that his companion had died, much to Wanga's surprise. 2 murlocs can be seen silhouetted in an underground cave. One murloc devours the adventurer's corpse, saying that his strength is growing. He asks the murloc leader if there is still a lot of such food. He smiles wickedly and says that besides the adventurers, there is also a group of gnolls in the forest, which will be enough for him to grow. This murloc is a manhas eater, current level to 2-3. To grow successfully, the corpse it devours must be at least as high as its own level. He turned around, glaring at the murloc leader with a huge red eye, and opened his bloody mouth with many sharp teeth, telling them to bring them here. The murloc leader replied that this was not possible at the moment because their military strength had weakened to the point where they couldn't handle the gnolls right now. Squinting, Death Eater Man has asked how long it would take. He said it would take 50 sunrises and sunsets. The adventurer's bloody corpse lies on the ground. Next to him is a large black dog with erect ears and red eyes. This is Cerberus, test level 6. Turning to the man and woman in the coat, he barked several times. The man said that it looked like it was in this dungeon that he died. The man's name is Lanka. He is a level 9 adventurer. Main profession, demon warlock. Secondary profession, crime investigator. A woman pats Cerberus on the head, praising him for his excellent work. Her name is Ju Lei. She is a level 8 adventurer. Main profession, ranger. Secondary profession, the beast tamer. As she continued to pet Cerberus, she said that it was just like him because he was so reckless up until the Lan Kai agreed and said that he didn't expect this fool to commit suicide to cut off the others' escape route. Ju Lei asked that now, explaining that their spawn point is definitely in the water, and their professions and equipment are not suitable for underwater combat, and if they don't complete the mission, they will also be trapped in this dungeon. After a short pause, he said that the maximum number of applicants in this dungeon is 15, taking into account them, and this fool only 12, and if there is someone strong enough to help them complete the mission, they will be able to get out. Wenger and the other men are still standing by the lake. The man in the red vest is shouting that his companion's profession is characterized by strong combat skills underwater, and even that didn't help him get out, and there's definitely something wrong with this dungeon. The man with the shield looks at the adventurer's panel, gritting his teeth, and says that he doesn't know who they can't get out of here safely, and now their only way is to complete the mission, but the mission needs to be submerged, and all the adventurers who can fight underwater are dead. So Wenger suggested that we go back to the exit. Raising his index finger, he explained that apart from the person who failed the test, there were still 7 people who could enter, which meant that they could find someone who could help them complete the mission. A black murloc silently watches them from under the water. Cerberus was wary. When he saw Wenger and the others, he started barking. And Ju Lei turned around and said to look at them questioningly. When Wenger saw him, she recognized him as the king of assassins. She asked where he was from, if he was supposed to be in Gondong. Lan Kai adjusted his glasses. He asked Wenger if they had succeeded. The men replied that he had never intended to enter here at all, and they were deceived. Canteen of the Adventurers Association. Lan Jiakun raises his fists and shouts gleefully to the protagonist that this is the first time he's ever heard of epic items being offered for the head of a level 6 adventurer. As he chewed on the food and held a bowl and chopsticks in his hand, he replied that it wasn't something to be proud of. Frowning, he said that no matter how you look at it, it's strange that the reward is exactly like this, and it's also public. He asked me how the ad came to be in the first place. Lanjia-kun frowned and pressed his index finger on his forehead, saying that Changhai was right, and it was strange even if the laws for adventurers and ordinary people were different. But this was the first time he had ever seen a reward offered for an official member of the association. Yao, when Zhang came to their table with a tray in his hands and said that it was because the customer was special. He explained that he made some inquiries and found out that the deceased adventurer was an eyewitness to what happened in Tianmen. A huge purple skull, emitting a huge amount of dark purple energy, complains about how painful it is, surrounded by helicopters. This is a level 18 challenge, Tomb of Terror. Likos Relak, the reason for the inability to fix it is unknown. 6 people are looking up at him. Zhu Zhanming, a man with red hair and beard, a level 18 adventurer, a Sunday to Monday, shouted, "Come on." They rushed forward at the skull, which had a bright light out of its mouth and eyes. Changhai asked in surprise about the fact that his descendants received all the inheritance and a bunch of privileges. Chewing, Yao Wenzhong replied that since his grandson had died in the underground cemetery, and Changhai had saved to ordinary citizens instead of him, blocking his chance to Jie. Frowning, the main character asked that their conflict could not be resolved just like that. Yao Wenjui, still chewing, replied that it wasn't necessary. He explained that the boss had already set up a meeting with the head of Fujian. He was also an old friend of Zhanming and the late adventurer's granddaughter to discuss the matter. He concluded that they would find out in the afternoon. The blonde-haired guy scratched his head and asked if they were late. Lin is standing behind him. Across from them is Ju Cheng, who is fixing her hair in exasperation, and a burly man with long dark brown hair. The serious-faced man replied that he was just in time. His name is Huang Zun, and he is the person in charge of dungeons in Fujian province, a level 18 adventurer, a mage slayer. The blonde-haired man's name is Zhang Renjin, and he's the entrance manager of the Dongshan City Adventurers Association, a level 14 adventurer, a legendary candidate. Zhang Renjin chuckled confidently, removing his hand from the back of his head. The main character's house. A guy in a green jacket, falling to the floor in front of the dungeon entrance, shouts about why he can't enter. He irritably asks why they entered without problems, and when it was his turn, the problem started. Adventurers are standing near the exit of the dungeon and discussing something. Straight yellow hair guy, Zhangjai Crossing, level 8 adventurer, main profession, the magic archer shouts, asking that there is no Changhai in the dungeon, and that you will have to dive to complete the mission. The man with the shield told him that it wasn't necessary to do this in the first place, but Shenmu had messed up everything, and as a result, the mission wouldn't be over without this dive, and they wouldn't be able to get out. Adjusting his glasses, Lan Kai said that the supplies in the forest would definitely not last for long. A voice in the crowd shouted, asking what they should do and whether they would have to fight for supplies. Another asked if anyone had water and food in their inventory, adding that they would pay. The plump man stood silently by the tree, adjusting his mustache with a smug grin. His name is Kaiomo. He is a level 8 adventurer, and his main profession is a werewolf. It can take the form of a 6th level fish man.